Chapter 85. The sea breeze continued to blow, and the tea in the cup was replaced. Jingjiu won 2 more games in a row. At this time, he finally caught the attention of many people. It was because his bamboo hat was really eye-catching in the pavilion, and also because he had won several games in a row. The most surprising thing was his speed. Although the Four Seas banquet had a time limit, his chess moves were too fast. Especially in the recent game, his opponent was a famous chess master in Haijo. He was not a cultivator, but was invited by the Western Sea Sword School to participate in the Four Seas banquet because of his devotion to Taoism. Who would have thought that he would still lose, and in such an inexplicable way? The caretaker of the West Ocean Sword Sect knew how to play Go, and he was the only one who had watched all of Jingjiu's games from beginning to end, so he was amazed. In the beginning, Jingjiu's Go playing was not very skillful, even worse than a beginner's. But as the games went on, he became more and more proficient, and sometimes his Go playing was even more marvelous. It seemed that his Go playing skill had improved a lot in such a short time. It was unclear how he did it. Calculation. After looking at the records of the first few games, someone finally realized something. He gasped and said, "This guy's arithmetic ability is too strong." Obviously, he was a newbie. In the beginning, some of his moves were even a little ridiculous, but he always won. Why? This was because his deduction and calculation abilities were too strong. As long as he didn't make any fatal mistakes in the beginning, he could start fighting from the middle of the game and continuously gain benefits from those small battles. In the end, he could completely reverse the disadvantage he had at the beginning and not give his opponent any chance. But even if he was a cultivator, who was better than ordinary people in all aspects, there was a limit to one's strength. Who could completely calculate such a complicated situation on the chessboard? It was unheard of that one could win chess with only calculation ability. No one believed that Jingjiu could keep winning. Besides, even if he could win a few games in such a way, what was the point? No matter how strict the time limit of the Four Seas banquet was, chess was always the slowest. He only needed to play a piece for the zither, write a few words for the calligraphy, and draw was a little more troublesome, but it was just a game. Apart from chess, the results of the other 3 events were soon out. Shui Yu Nunnery's MO. She had the best zither skills. She was the disciple of the nunnery master. Attending the Four Seas banquet was already a great honor for the Western Sea Sword School. She played a piece of music in person, which was a great honor. It would be a problem if she couldn't get first place in the Guqin skills competition. Of course, her music was indeed beautiful. Everyone in the pavilion on Lonely Mountain who had heard that song could testify. The Zhongzhou school was considered by many cultivation practitioners to be the #1 sect in the world. The disciple participating in the Four Seas banquet this time was called Xiang Wanshu. Xiang Wanshu was a famous talented youth, and it was said that his magic methods were taught by his big brother Tong Yen. Zhongzhou school had given Western Sea Sword School enough face, so Western Sea Sword School naturally knew what to do. This is a true master of calligraphy and painting. The cultivators stood in front of the building, admiring the central hall painting and the meticulous flower and bird painting beside it. Xiang Wanshu walked out of the building. People came up to him to express their admiration. Xiang Wanshu's expression was calm, and he responded with a smile, like the spring breeze. Only the other side hadn't gotten the result yet. The sounds of discussion and even quarreling could be heard in the distant pavilion. It was rare to see such a lively scene in a gathering of the cultivation world. Xiang Wanshu was curious, and he walked toward the pavilion surrounded by the crowd. When he arrived in front of the pavilion, someone had already announced his identity. The crowd parted like the tide, letting him walk to the front. An enlarged chessboard was hung in the pavilion, with many chess pieces on it. The game seemed to be in a stalemate. Looking at the chessboard, Xiang Wanshu raised his eyebrows slightly, then shook his head, as if he didn't understand. Why did Immortal Master Wanshu shake his head? Someone asked. Xiang Wanshu smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. The disciples of Zhongzhou school paid particular attention to moderation, and wouldn't talk about others easily. He thought that Haizhou was after all a small and remote county. Though the Four Seas banquet was a big event, it didn't have any outstanding figures. For example, he had drawn a flower and bird painting and written a few words, and received so much praise. If these people saw the calligraphy and paintings of the scholars of Yamatsai at the plum meeting a few years ago, what would they think? Another example would be the last game of the chess tournament. The two players in the building should be the best chess players in the Four Seas banquet, but their chess moves were so bad, even crude. If they were in the plum meeting, they would have been eliminated in the first round. Not to mention his big brother or himself, even his young brother would have won. As he was thinking about all this, a sound came from inside the building. The winner of the last game had been decided. Jingju stood up and walked to the back of the screen, preparing to wash his hands. The caretakers of the Western Sea Sword School and some other people in the building looked at his back, not knowing what to say. The crowd had a strange feeling. No matter how they looked at it, this person hadn't played chess for a long time, so how could he have won? Because of this feeling, the atmosphere was a bit weird. No one spoke, and no one congratulated him. It was a bit awkward for a while. Suddenly, a voice came from the crowd outside the building. Immortal Master Wanshu, what do you think of this person's chess skills? Xiang Wanshu's gaze shifted slightly, and he found the speaker. It was a thin and tall old man. For some reason, his face was full of resentment and anger. Xiang Wanshu said, "My chess skills are very ordinary, so I'm not qualified to comment on this cultivation, brother." The thin and tall old man was the chess master of Haizhou who had lost to Jingjiu. He still couldn't believe that he had lost until now. The thin and tall old man wasn't a cultivation practitioner, but he knew something about the Zhongzhou school for some reason. Perhaps he was too angry because he couldn't understand the situation, or perhaps he had some evil intentions. He brought up the question. He didn't try to hide it. He squeezed through the crowd and came before Xiang Wanshu, saying, "Immortal Master, you don't have to be so modest. I heard that even young Master Tong Yen only gave you a handicap of 3 pieces." There was an uproar in the crowd upon hearing this. If one were to name the most famous genius in the cultivation world, the name Tong Yen would be the first to come to mind. Even Zhuo Ruzhui, the personal disciple of the sect master of Aoyama sect, couldn't compare to him in some aspects. Tong Yan's talent in cultivation was the best in Zhongzhou, and he was still the idol of many people. In addition to this, Tong Yan was also famous for his Go-playing skill. A few years ago, he had won the first prize 3 times in a row at the plum meeting. Even those scholars in Yamatsai were convinced of his achievements. There was another saying that Tong Yan had been trying to comprehend the heavenly law through chess. No matter how one looked at it, Tong Yan was undoubtedly the best chess player in the world. He only gave Xiang Wanshu a handicap of 3 pieces? The crowd looked at Xiang Wanshu with more respect and fear in their eyes. It was a bit too humble for him to say that his chess skills were ordinary. If the immortal Master Wanshu had participated in the chess tournament today, he wouldn't be a master of calligraphy and painting, but a master of chess, calligraphy, and painting. Xiang Wanshu said with a bitter smile, "Compared to my big brother, my chess skills are like a candle flame in front of a pearl, and so are my calligraphy and painting skills. I don't deserve such praise." The thin and tall elder didn't give up, insisting, "But you are definitely qualified to comment on today's chess game. Please tell us, what is going on in this game? What is wrong with this person? How could he win if he played such an ugly game?" For those who loved chess, the shape of the chess game was very important. Besides winning or losing, they also had to pay attention to the aesthetics of the game. Jingjiu's chess playing was completely unsystematic, so it was even less aesthetically pleasing. Xiang Wanshu felt a bit awkward about this, but he still didn't want to criticize Jingjiu. This cultivation friend has an amazing calculating ability, but his game is a bit ugly, he said. Yeah? I told you it's ugly. It's like cutting grass and picking dung. Who plays chess like that? The thin and tall elder suddenly became excited, yelling, even if he can win for a while by playing like this, can he keep winning? Due to the influence of Tong Yen, the disciples of Zhongzhou school respected the chess playing very much, which was why Xiang Wanshu was willing to do the semi-cursive calligraphy and painting, but not participate in the chess tournament. In his eyes, the arrangement of the Four Seas banquet was a bit disrespectful to the chess game. Xiang Wanshu thought what the thin and tall elder said was too harsh, but he agreed with him. If I played like this, I would be beaten by my big brother for sure, he said with a smile. There was a burst of laughter in the crowd. A cold voice suddenly came from outside the crowd. The Zhongzhou school is just like what the rumors say, polite, hypocritical, and annoying. Hearing this, the crowd was shocked, wondering who would dare say such a thing in front of the talented disciples of the Zhongzhou school. In all of Chaotian, Yamatsai kept a low profile, Guoqing Temple didn't compete, and the Western Sea Sword School wouldn't cause any trouble at their home ground. Could it be someone from the Windy Broadsword Church or the Aoyama sect? Chapter 86. Thinking that the winner was also wearing a conical hat, the crowd suddenly realized that this young girl was that person's companion, and that was why she said such a thing. Xiang Wanshu asked, "Please tell me, how am I being hypocritical?" His expression was calm, devoid of anger, but giving off a sense of oppression. He had a mild temperament and didn't want to cause trouble, but someone insulted his sect, so how could he not speak up? It suddenly became quiet, and the atmosphere was a bit tense. The young girl standing by the cliff's edge was none other than Zhao Lei. Looking at Xiang Wanshu, she said nonchalantly, "You said that if you played like this, your big brother would beat you. Does that mean that he should be beaten for playing like this?" This statement seemed a bit forced, but if one thought about what Xiang Wanshu had said earlier, it would be the same. Xiang Wanshu raised his eyebrows slightly, asking, "What do you mean by hypocritical?" Zhao Lei said, "You think he is bad at playing chess, but you don't want to admit it. You even want to beat him, but you don't dare do it. This is hypocrisy." Xiang Wanshu shook his head, saying, "It's not hypocrisy. I just want to save some face for your companion." "Do you think you are qualified to judge him?" Zhao Lei asked. There was a slight commotion in the crowd, thinking that what she said was ridiculous. The person who was given 3 moves when playing chess with Tong Yen was of course qualified to judge her companion. Xiang Wanshu raised his eyebrows slightly, saying, "That's right. I want to tell him that playing chess is not so simple. Believe me, for him, playing chess is the simplest thing in the world," Zhao Lei said. When she said this, she thought, if you saw the porcelain plate next to the bamboo chair, if you saw the gravel in the porcelain plate, you would understand what she meant. Xiang Wanshu said, "Really? I hope I will have a chance to learn from him later." "You can't do it. Let your big brother do it." Zhao Lei's tone was natural, as if she were talking about something normal. There was an uproar in the crowd. The Western Sea Sword School held the Four Seas Banquet to compete with the Plum Meeting, but everybody knew that the Four Seas Banquet and the Plum Meeting had an insurmountable gap in terms of resources and other aspects. Do you think that just because your companion won first place in the Four Seas Banquet, he is qualified to play chess with Tong Yen? Who was Tong Yen? Was it something that ordinary cultivators could see? Xiang Wanshu didn't know what to say, smiling bitterly, thinking that she was an ignorant little girl. His anger subsided, and he didn't pay any more attention to her. An hour later, Xiang Wanshu saw the little girl again. The winners of the Four Seas Banquet, as well as the invited guests, would board a sea boat from the lonely mountain to the cloud platform in the sky. Xiang Wanshu could of course use the magic method to go up in the air, but he chose to wait here out of respect for the Western Sea Sword School. He looked at the edge of the cliff and his gaze fell on the bamboo hats of the two people. He shook his head, wondering which sect they were spoiled disciples. "How do you feel? Is it interesting?" Zhao Liu asked. "Not much," replied Jingjiu. Zhao Liu asked, "What do you mean?" "Playing chess is not about one's own cultivation, but winning by relying on the opponent's mistakes. It's boring." He added after some thought, "And it's too simple." The sea boat had no sails, rising with the wind. Soon, it left the ground and sailed into the clouds. Amidst the lingering clouds, one could vaguely see the jagged cliffs and the pavilions that were right in front of them. Some of the cultivation practitioners who visited the Western Sea Sword School for the first time found out that the cloud platform was actually a mountain suspended in the air in the cloud. The sea boat stopped atop the peak. The disciples of the Western Sea Sword School came forward and led the guests into a magnificent palace hall. The invited guests of various sects were already seated in the hall, enjoying the mermaids' song and dance, discussing something in low voices. Xiang Wanshu, Mo Shi, and Jing Jiu walked into the hall as the winners of the Four Seas banquet. Many people stood up to greet them, showing their respect for the Four Seas banquet, as well as for the sects of Xiang Wanshu and Mo Shi. Some gazes fell on Jing Jiu, who was still wearing the conical hat when he came into the hall, looking a bit weird. Among these gazes, one was hidden in the dark, full of evil and hatred. Another two gazes were full of shock and confusion. Yao Songshan and Lin Yingliang of the Aoyama sect changed their expressions slightly, wondering why he was here. Didn't he know the Pure Heaven Bureau was looking for them? What was he going to do? As they came to the deep end of the hall, a figure emerged from the clouds and fog. It was a tall man with a dignified temperament, wearing a bright yellow cloth. A dozen beaded curtains hung in front of his crown, obscuring his face. He looked down at Jingjiu like a real emperor. This was Shi Wang's son, the most mysterious figure in the cultivation circle in recent years. Jingjiu looked at him in silence. Xiang Wanshu and Mo Shi had already returned to the front hall, wondering what kind of treasures the Western Sea Sword School had given them. Jingjiu was the only one here, which was a bit weird. The path to heaven is boundless, so we have to take a broader view. We can't give up the whole forest just because of one tree. Shi Wang's son's voice was very gentle, like the round and flawless pearls of the South Ocean on the beaded curtains. The first half of this statement was like a common advice from a master to a junior, but the second half was quite odd. Jingjiu thought silently that he was not him. By now, he knew who Shi Wang's son was, and he also knew who he was not. Shi Wang's son looked at Jingjiu with a faint smile. It was interesting that he also thought he knew who this young cultivation practitioner wearing the conical hat was. He thought that this young cultivation practitioner should have participated in the Four Seas banquet and come to join him because he was pursued by the imperial court. He knew what had happened in the Sea God Temple that night, but he didn't feel angry. On the contrary, he appreciated their courage and ability, feeling that these two young people had the potential to be cultivated, though the one in front of him with the iron sword on his back obviously hadn't entered the state of the undefeated and was far inferior to the other. However, he wouldn't let the Western Sea Sword School accept them. He would do it under another name. That was why he said the second half of his statement. It was quiet, and Jingjiu didn't respond. Shi Wang's son narrowed his eyes, showing a cruel expression. "If you don't want to join me, why did you come to participate in my Four Seas banquet?" he asked. "I just wanted to see you," Jingjiu said. This was an unexpected answer. Shi Wang's son looked at him in silence and suddenly asked, "Do you still want my treasures?" Jingjiu shook his head. Hearing this, Shi Wang's son thought Jingjiu hadn't made up his mind yet and wanted to show his friendliness. After a moment of silence, he waved his hand to signal Jingjiu to leave. The grand hall of the Western Sea Sword School was very spacious, with a radius of 3,000 feet. The thin mist moved along the ground, and the guests sat scattered in the hall. If it weren't for the keen eyesight of cultivators, they wouldn't even be able to see each other's faces clearly. Jingju returned to the grand hall and walked to the table where Zhao Lei was sitting, ready to leave with her. A gloomy voice rang out. Wearing a conical hat at the banquet? Are you so shameful? Or have you done so many evil things that you don't dare to show your faces? The guests were a bit surprised. They looked toward the source of the voice and found it was a skinny middle-aged cultivator in a black Taoist robe with a wretched face. A cultivator who knew this person whispered something to the guest. Then the guests learned that this middle-aged cultivator was the free-traveling cultivator, Zhu Jie. It was said that this person had a good relationship with the Western Sea Sword School, so it wasn't surprising that he appeared at the Four Seas banquet today. Zhu Jie had the same bad reputation as his deceased elder brother, Zhu Gui, the head monk of the Black Dragon Temple. Naturally, no one wanted to talk to him. Normally, he would finish the banquet and then boast about how the Western Sea Sword School treated him well, and how he could chat and laugh with the talented disciples of Zhongzhou School. But today was different. Chapter 87. It was the suggestion of the Pure Heaven Bureau that Zhu Jie stood out to provoke them. The Pure Heaven Bureau had already arranged the magic army to guard the surroundings of the Lone Mountain, but they were worried that they would escape by riding their swords, so they decided to do it on the cloud platform. There were many cultivation swordsmen here, and the number of swordsmen from the Western Sea Sword School was even greater. The only thing that worried the Pure Heaven Bureau was that the Western Sea Sword School might be displeased by the disruption of the Four Seas banquet. As such, the best way to deal with them was to find a way to provoke them. As long as they attacked first, the Western Sea Sword School couldn't blame the Imperial Court, and they might even help them. The best candidate was of course Zhu Jie, because he had a good relationship with the Western Sea Sword School, so he could speak freely in the Grand Hall, and his words were really unpleasant. Or is it because you're too ugly? Did someone cut your face a few times with a knife when you were a child and disfigured you? Of course, it's also possible that you're so beautiful that you don't want others to see your face. Take off your conical hat. I like pretty girls. If I like you, I'll take good care of you. Zhu Jie kept on talking, his words extremely frivolous and humiliating. The cultivation practitioners in the Grand Hall felt it strange, thinking how vulgar his words were. Even if he had a good relationship with the Western Sea Sword School, he shouldn't be afraid of offending the master by making such a scene. As for why he was so confident his brother was dead, and the royal concubine didn't have a good relationship with him, Zhao Lei remained silent, and didn't retort no matter how he insulted her. Nobody noticed that the two disciples of the Aoyama sect had terrible expressions on their faces. Yao Songshan of Liangwang Peak narrowed his eyes and raised his eyebrows, ready to kill someone. Xiang Wanshu of the Zhongzhou School and Mo Shi of Shuiyu Nunnery were sitting next to the Aoyama sect, and they noticed the change in Yao Songshan's energy, their expressions a bit grave. Little girl. Zhu Jie kept on insulting Zhao Lei, full of malice and mockery. Suddenly, his voice stopped abruptly. Suddenly, a bright red light appeared in the spacious and empty hall. There was a faint smell of blood in the fragrant air. There was a hole in Zhu Jie's throat, and blood gushed out like a waterfall. The flying sword pierced through the air and returned to Zhao Lei, disappearing into her palm. Only then did Zhu Jie realize what had happened. His eyes were filled with shock and despair as he covered his throat with both hands. Blood flowed out from between his fingers. The scene was extremely tragic. No one could save his life. Zhu Jie's face was pale, and he slowly knelt on the ground. He let out a few sounds like broken bellows, and just like that, he stopped breathing. The hall was in an expanse of shock. Many cultivators stood up and looked over with the intention of seeing exactly what had happened. Countless gazes fell on Zhao Lei. Other than shock, there was also a lot of fear. She was more than 1,000 feet away from Zhu Jie, yet she was able to kill him with one strike. Moreover, the sword was hidden in her palm. According to the most popular state classification of Aoyama sect in the southern continent, didn't that mean she had already entered the middle state of the undefeated? Xiang Wanshu and Mo she glanced at each other, seeing the shock in each other's eyes. This young woman with the conical hat should be about the same age as them, but her state was actually higher than theirs? Who was she? And what kind of sword was that flying sword of hers? How could it have such a terrifying lethal intent? How dare you commit murder in public in broad daylight? An angry voice rang out outside the hall. The officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau had finally appeared. Seeing Zhu Jie lying in a pool of blood, Shifengchen's face turned livid, his heart heavy. Zhu Jie had done what he had asked, and successfully enraged his opponent, but he couldn't stop her from killing him. This made Shifengchen feel a sense of defeat that he had never felt before, and he was extremely angry. Shifengchen took a deep breath to calm himself down, and said to the cultivators in the hall, "I want all the immortal masters to know that this murderer with the conical hat is a wanted criminal by the imperial court. She has killed nearly 100 people in the last 2 years, and has done many evil deeds. Don't let her escape." The cultivation practitioners who had attended the meeting of the Pure Heaven Bureau in Haijo City were the first to react. They stood up from their seats, calling out their swords and magic treasures. The hall was filled with green lights, full of lethal intent. Xiang Wanshu looked at Zhao Lei, raising his eyebrows slightly, as if he didn't expect this young woman to be an evil person. Mo Shi's gaze also fell on her, her willowy eyebrows furrowed, showing a disgusted expression. To the surprise of the officials of the Pure Heaven Bureau and the cultivation practitioners, the 2 monk doctors of the Guoqing Temple didn't move, neither did Zui Yushir of Ozawa. Even more surprisingly, Yao Songshan didn't move either. Wasn't he the immortal master of Liangwang Peak of the Oyama sect famous for his warlike and hatred of evildoers? Zhao Lei killed Zhu Jie with one swing of her sword from a distance of more than 300 yards. Her cultivation state was indeed very high, but there were too many swordsmen in the hall, such as Elder He Jichong of Kunlun, Xiang Wanshu and the others, not to mention that this was the home court of the Western Sea Sword School, and the elder sitting in the main seat was a highly achieved swordsman in the state of free travel. Normally, Zhao Lei couldn't kill Zhu Jie under such circumstances. Her attack was too sudden. Others could kill without saying a word, but she could kill without saying a word. Most importantly, no one would have thought that she would dare to use her sword to kill someone in this place. This was the Cloudy Platform, an important place of the Western Sea Sword School. Though the formation had been suspended because of the Four Seas banquet, killing someone here was tantamount to provoking the Western Sea Sword School. The elder of the Western Sea Sword School looked at Zhao Lei coldly, and the powerful piercing discernment had already enveloped her. Shi Wang's son still didn't show up, nor did he make a sound. Nobody knew that this mysterious swordsman of the Western Sea was observing everything in the deep end of the hall in silence. Everything was under his control. He wanted to see how the 2 young men with conical hats would deal with the current situation, and then he would let them go. "You will pay for the blood debt of the sect masters of 3 today." He Jichong, the elder of the Kunlun sect, stood up slowly and said to Zhao Lei. As soon as he finished speaking, an extremely sharp full moon whizzed through the air, chopping toward Zhao Lei with an extremely fierce, killing intent. Suddenly, a flying sword flew up from below. The flying sword was shining brightly, and its speed was so fast that it looked like a perfectly straight blue line. A loud clang. The full moon was chopped by the flying sword from below, and flew back to the elder of the Kunlun sect at an angle, spinning in the air and making a whining sound. The elder of the Kunlun sect had a ruddy face, and his hair and beard were all standing on end. Blood trickled down from the corner of his mouth, and he looked a little embarrassed. The flying sword was indeed powerful, but the state of the swordsman was not higher than his, so he was unprepared and suffered a loss. Chapter 88. It was surprising enough that the disciple of Liangwang Peak of the Aoyama sect didn't attack the demoness first. Who would have thought that when the Kunlun elders intended to kill the other party, he would actually help the demoness with his sword? What was going on? Shi Fengqian stared at Yao Songshan, his eyes full of shock and anger. As he was about to ask, he suddenly thought of a possibility, his expression changing abruptly. The subordinate official of the Pure Heaven Bureau didn't think of what Shi Fengqian had thought of, his face turning pale with fright. Immortal Master Yao, what are you doing? The elder of Kunlun came back to his senses and said sternly, I know those senior masters of the sect of three acted improperly in Chaonan City and offended the Aoyama sect, but everybody saw this demoness kill Immortal Master Zhu Jie with their own eyes. Do you think the Aoyama sect will protect her? Zhu Jie was rude to my senior master, so he deserves to die. Yao Songshan walked forward slowly, looking at the elder of Kunlun, and said nonchalantly, As for you, you dared attack my senior master, you have a death wish. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall. The green cloth worn by Yao Songshan fluttered in the ocean wind, making him look like an immortal. The crowd wondered if they had heard what he said clearly. Rude to my senior master? Dared attack my senior master? Senior master, what senior master? Yao Songshan was the 11th disciple of Liangwang Peak, so who was his senior master? Countless gazes fell on Zhao Lei. Zhao Lei took off her conical hat. Regrettably, they didn't get to see her beautiful black hair flowing down like a waterfall. This young girl had short hair and a pair of short but powerful eyebrows. The reason why it was said to be powerful was because her eyebrows were thick, as if they were painted with the thickest ink. More and more people guessed her identity. They were shocked speechless, standing up one after another. The sound of tables being overturned could be heard everywhere in the grand hall. In the cultivation world, Zhao Lei was very famous. She was even close to catching up to Lo Huainan, Tong Yen, Bai Zhao, Zhuoruzhui, and others. She was an innate Dao seed. Before she was even born, she was already the target of Aoyama sect's protection. 3 years ago, in the inherited sword competition in Aoyama, she surprised everyone by allowing Shinma Peak to continue the inheritance and became the second disciple of Zhenren Jingyang, which shocked the entire cultivation world. Her appearance and temperament had already been discussed countless times in the various sections. This short-haired girl had picturesque eyebrows and distinct black and white eyes. The disciples of Liangwang Peak addressed her as senior master. Who else could she be but Zhao Lei? Everybody stood up, no matter how they felt about the Green Mountain sect and Zhao Lei or how they felt at the moment. Mo Shi, a disciple of Shui Yu Nunnery, also stood up. She found that Zhao Lei looked like a girl with a delicate and pretty face, nothing special about her. She couldn't help but look down on her. But in the next moment, she thought of the bloody sword that had pierced through the grand hall, and her expression changed slightly, feeling ashamed of her inferiority. Xiang Wanshu was surprised. He didn't expect the girl he had met on the Lone Mountain to be the rumored Zhao Lei. In the minds of the disciples of Zhongzhou school, Zhao Lei was different from the talented disciples of other sections. Zhao Lei was from Zhaoge. According to the saying that all the talented disciples of Zhaoge would enter the center sect, she should have joined Zhongzhou school. In that case, she should have been his big sister or young sister. The masters of Zhongzhou school had tried hard for 10 years to change the Zhao family's mind, but the Aoyama sect was too strict. These stories had been circulating in Zhongzhou school for a long time. So many disciples, including Xiang Wanshu, were curious about Zhao Lei. They also had an indescribable feeling, a feeling of intimacy and also a feeling of resistance. Most of the young disciples regarded her as an imaginary enemy. It was still quiet in the grand hall, and it was hard for people to calm down. Some of them noticed the person standing by Zhao Lei. If this girl was Zhao Lei, then who was the person wearing the conical hat? Judging from the iron sword, this person hadn't entered the undefeated state yet, and was much weaker than Zhao Lei. Was he Jingjiu? After the inherited sword of Shinma Peak, Jingjiu had gained some fame in the cultivation circle, though he was far less famous than Zhao Lei. Yet, in some people's minds, he was even more famous than Zhao Lei, because it was rumored that he was an exceptionally handsome man. Jingjiu had no intention of taking off the conical hat, which made the female cultivation practitioners, including Mo Shi, feel a bit regretful. "Oh, it's the master of Shinma Peak of Aoyama. Please forgive me for not welcoming you earlier." As a gentle voice rang out, a cloud and fog came up from the deep end of the grand hall, and a tall figure walked out slowly from the fog. The mysterious Shiwang's son had finally shown up in front of the world. Shiwang's son was forced to show up. Zhao Lei was the master of Shinma Peak, an important figure in Aoyama sect. Moreover, she was the personal disciple of the immortal Jingyang. In terms of seniority and status, she was the most powerful person in the Grand Hall today. The elders of Western Sea Sword School and Kunlun had the same seniority as her, but their status in the cultivation circle was far lower than hers. On the cloud platform, only Shiwang's son's status could be considered equal to hers, so he had to come out and welcome her in person to show his respect to Aoyama sect. Before Shiwang's son showed up, the elder of the Western Sea Sword School in the state of free travel had withdrawn his sword discernment, just as Zhao Lei had revealed her identity. If he had withdrawn his sword discernment a bit slower, he would have been regarded as disrespectful to Aoyama sect, which might have led to a dispute. Shiwang's son greeted Zhao Lei with a smile, and then looked at Jingjiu beside her. Thinking of what Jingjiu had said when they met earlier, a ferocious glint flashed in the deep end of his eyes. At this moment, he was sure that Jingjiu didn't want to seek refuge with Western Sea Sword School. At that time, Jingjiu said to him, "I just want to see you." "See what?" "Did Aoyama sect know about the Dace Devil and send their disciples to investigate?" Thinking of this, even he was a bit vigilant. But he didn't worry too much, because he believed that no matter how hard Aoyama sect investigated, even if they found all the way to West Sea through the Dace Devil, they still wouldn't find any evidence. The layout of the Dace Devil was not deliberately arranged, and it was only aimed at the ambition of the cultivation practitioners. Thinking that the disciple with natural Tao quality of Aoyama sect had eaten the monster pill 2 years ago, Shiwang's son showed an enigmatic smile. A monster pill, which could help the cultivation practitioners improve their state, and a cultivation method that could erase the traces of Dan poison was a temptation that no cultivation practitioner could resist. The more talented they were, the more pressure and expectations they had to bear, and the more they couldn't resist the temptation. Looking at Jingjiu and Zhao Lei, Shiwang's son thought with a smile, "Go ahead and investigate. The more serious you are, the better. It would be best if you could find out who your talented disciple is." Jingjiu was thinking about something else. After Zhao Lei revealed her identity, Shiwang's son showed up to welcome her in person. If he had known it would be so easy, he wouldn't have played those games of chess on the lonely mountain. It seemed that after countless years of cultivation and traveling, he was still not experienced enough in this aspect. "What about you? Didn't you say that you were good at scheming?" He looked at Zhao Lei beside him and shook his head, thinking that she was indeed a disciple of Shinma Peak, but she was a bit stupid in this aspect. At this moment, a voice rang out. At first, that person's voice trembled slightly, and it was unclear whether he was angry or uneasy, but it soon became steady, firm, and unbreakable. "Do you think that just because you are a big shot of Aoyama sect, you can kill people at will?" Chapter 89. Zhao Lei glanced at him, but didn't say anything. In the eyes of the crowd, she looked extremely indifferent. "That's right," the elder of Kunlun said angrily. "That day in Chaonan City, the disciples of the sect of 3 competed for the medicine for the injury of a fellow disciple. It was just a trivial dispute. How could they die?" Hearing this, many people looked at Zhao Lei with a hint of fear. Even though she was the 9th peak master of the Aoyama sect, how could she be so cruel? Thinking of the scene where Zhao Lei killed Zhu Jie without saying a word, the crowd felt that this rumored genius girl had a terrifying temperament. Just a trivial matter? Lin Yingliang walked forward and sneered at the elder of Kunlun. That day, the 2 highly achieved monks of the Guoqing Temple wanted to use the medicine to cure the residents of Chaonan City who were frightened by the Dace Devil. The practitioners and the rich merchants in the Precious Tree House all gave up bidding for the medicine and were willing to help. However, the disciples of the sect of 3 tried to stop the young master from getting the medicine because he was poisoned by the flowers and felt itchy. Relying on the wealth of Kunlun, they increased the price of the medicine. Senior Master Zhao couldn't stand this behavior, so she bought the Borneal with a Xianxiao pill and wanted to give it to the 2 highly achieved monks of the Guoqing Temple. But she was stopped by the disciples of the sect of 3, who wanted to steal the medicine. They didn't know my senior master's identity, and they even wanted to kill him. They deserved to die. Lin Yingliang and his big brother Yao Songzhan had learned about this incident in the immortal house of Haizhou a few days ago. Comparing it with the files of the Pure Heaven Bureau, they figured out what had happened. Now that he told the story, it was almost the same as the truth, causing a heated discussion in the Grand Hall. The old monk of the Guoqing Temple uttered a Zen chant and said to the crowd, "This poor monk was at the Precious Tree House at the time, and many practitioners can testify." Hearing this, the crowd in the Grand Hall believed 90% of the story. The reputation of the Guoqing Temple in the world was impeccable, and everybody believed that the old monk wouldn't lie. The elder of the Kunlun Immortal sect wanted to say that nobody had seen Zhao Lei kill someone in the alley, so nobody knew what was going on, but judging from the atmosphere in the Grand Hall, he knew it was useless to say so he couldn't help but feel angry. What about the others? Shi Fengqian took a few more steps forward, getting closer to Zhao Lei. He stared into Zhao Lei's eyes and said, "In Shangzhou City, 4 passers-by were killed by your sword. The one you beheaded outside Tianjing City was a divine guard. The one you chopped into pieces in Yuzhou City was an old woman. I want to know how they offended the Peak Lord. How could they offend the Peak Master?" Zhao Lei raised her eyebrows and was about to say something. Jingjiu glanced at her. The Peak Master of Aoyama was rendered speechless by an official of the imperial court? No one believed it. Many people thought that Zhao Lei refused to defend herself because it was beneath her dignity to argue with this official of the imperial court. However, they did not know that it was because Jingjiu found it troublesome. Those people didn't offend the senior master, but they must have offended the sword of Aoyama. Yao Songzhan looked at Shi Fengqian and said coldly, "The sword cries when it encounters injustice. I think you know better than anyone else why those people died by the senior master's sword." Shi Fengqian sneered. "In the last 2 years, the Peak Master has traveled around the world and killed more than 70 people. Don't you need to give us an explanation?" Yao Songzhan looked at this official of the imperial court as if he was looking at a rock. "Our Aoyama sword sect has killed a few evildoers, and we need an explanation? Who is qualified to ask us for an explanation?" What a domineering statement! What a sharp sword! It was deathly quiet in the Grand Hall. Since the Aoyama sect had said so, who would dare oppose it? "Big brother, what you said is inappropriate. Even if you draw your sword when it encounters injustice, it's still a matter of life and death. We should be cautious." It was Xiang Wanshu who spoke. Emoshi also shook his head and said, "This is a bit too reckless." The atmosphere in the Grand Hall had changed subtly. It was interesting that the disciples of the Zhongzhou school and Shuiyu nunnery spoke at the same time. Among the major cultivation sects in the world, Yamatsai kept a low profile. Guoqing Temple didn't want to compete. The Windy Broadsword sect and the Western Sea Sword School didn't have enough resources, so the Zhongzhou school and Aoyama sect were the most orthodox sections. Since the Zhongzhou school was located near Zhaoga City, it had many talented disciples in the last few decades, and its reputation had even surpassed that of Aoyama. Shuiyu Nunnery didn't have many disciples, but it had the chief nun and a few elders in the Broken Sea state, and it was said that a legendary figure had a chance to enter the heavenly arrival state, so they couldn't be underestimated. Yao Songzhan was displeased. His displeasure was mostly directed at Mo Shi. If the Zhongzhou school had spoken, he could have rebuked them directly, but Shuiyu Nunnery and the Aoyama sect had always been on good terms, so he didn't know how much he should rebuke them. It was a bit troublesome for him. It was then that Jingjiu finally spoke. It was the first time the people in the grand hall had heard his voice. His voice was calm and mild, like the water flowing over the body of a sword. It was hard to tell whether it was the water or the sword. "Is Lien Sanyue your senior master?" Upon hearing this, there was an uproar in the hall. Mo Shi furrowed her brows, feeling quite angry. Lien Sanyue was the young sister of the sect master of Shuiyu Nunnery, but she was undoubtedly the most powerful person in Shuiyu Nunnery in terms of cultivation state. It was rumored that she was the one who had a chance to enter the heavenly arrival state. She was one of the most powerful swordsmen in the cultivation world, both in terms of seniority and experience. It was said that she greeted the sect master of Aoyama with the same courtesy. Judging from the relationship between the immortal Jingyang and Jingjiu, he was of the same generation as Lien Sanyue, but everybody in the cultivation world knew that he had followed Zhao Liu to the Shenma Peak. Even if they were of the same generation, how rude it was to address such a senior cultivation practitioner by her name. Mo Shi stared at Jingjiu with an unfriendly expression in her eyes, as if she wanted to see through his conical hat and find out how shameless he was. "Do you know why your senior master is called Lien Sanyue?" Jingjiu continued, as if he hadn't sensed anything. Back when the Snowy Kingdom invaded the south, the imperial court was interrupted, and the world was in chaos. The populace was destitute, and the people were living in misery and suffering. Moreover, the bandits occupied the roads and used the refugees as their food supply. Your senior master happened to come down from the mountain at that time. She killed 40,000 people in 3 months and burned down 17 bandits' stronghold. People said that the flames of war lasted for 3 months. That's how she got her name. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall as they listened to the story. The crowd wondered in astonishment if it was true. These events had happened too many times in the past, and had become a secret that no one knew about. For instance, Mo Shi had never heard of it before. "What are you talking about?" she retorted reflexively. "My senior master has a gentle temperament, how could she act like this, She suddenly realized that she didn't know how to describe the senior master in this story. It was a legend that she had saved thousands of people from danger, but she had killed 40,000 bandits in 3 months, many of whom were refugees, women, and children who had been kidnapped. How could she comment on this? Though the young cultivation practitioners didn't know about these events, it didn't mean that the cultivation practitioners of the older generation didn't know about them either. The elder of Kunlun fell silent, as he didn't want to recall that chaotic era. The elder of the Western Sea Sword School couldn't help but change his expression slightly when he thought of the bloody ocean. The old monk of the Guoqing temple shook his head helplessly, indicating to Mo Shi that these stories were true and that she shouldn't talk about them anymore. Mo Shi said anxiously, "Anyway, my senior master only killed evil people." Yao Songzhan sneered. "Are you saying that my senior master only killed good people? The Aoyama sect killed people to get rid of evil." This was the natural understanding of many cultivation practitioners and most of the common people. This was the confidence or foundation of the orthodox sections. Only the accumulation of countless years of merits could create such an unshakable image. Shi Fengchen knew that he had no way to arrest the culprit. even if he wanted to risk the condemnation of the whole world by mobilizing the magic army and the swordsmen of the imperial court to investigate the case. He didn't have the confidence to do so. The Western Sea Sword School would definitely remain neutral, and the sects like the Guoqing Temple and Ozawa would definitely stand on the side of the Aoyama sect. Though the Zhongzhou School and Shuei Nunnery had spoken out, if the imperial court and the Aoyama sect were to fight, they would never stand on the side of the imperial court. Moreover, how could an official of his level be qualified to represent the imperial court? "I'll report this to the imperial court." He looked at Zhao Liu and said, "I'll get an explanation from you, even if it's just an apology. Even if he had to pay the price with his life." He thought to himself. Zhao Liu didn't know what this official of the imperial court was thinking, nor did she care about the sad and stirring feeling he had. "Did you see him?" she asked Jingjiu. Jingjiu nodded. "Let's go then," Zhao Liu said. Xiang Wanshu suddenly said, "I hope we can meet at the plum meeting." As he said this, he looked at Jingjiu. There would also be zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting at the plum meeting. Next year, Jingjiu would participate in the plum meeting as the representative of the young disciples of the Aoyama sect. Since he won first place in the chess tournament at the Four Seas banquet, he would probably continue to participate in the chess tournament. Zhao Liu said, "As I said, you can't do it. Let your big brother do it." Xiang Wanshu's expression changed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Outside the building on the Lone Mountain, Zhao Liu had said the same thing. At the time, he thought she was a spoiled little girl who behaved absurdly, so he didn't pay much attention to her. But she was Zhao Liu, so what she said had nothing to do with absurdity. She really thought so. There was an uproar in the grand hall. In the Zhongzhou school, Xiang Wanshu had many big brothers, but the big brother who didn't add his name and was easily known was Tong Yen. What did Zhao Liu mean by saying this? Did she mean to challenge Tong Yen to a duel on behalf of Jingjiu? Were the Aoyama sect and the Zhongzhou school going to face off against each other? Thinking of this, the crowd couldn't help but look forward to it indefinitely. It was believed that the whole land would be shocked when this announcement was heard from the cloud platform. What would happen at the plum meeting next year? Chapter 90. Zhao Liu reached out her right hand. Jingjiu stretched out his left hand. "Hold it." The wind picked up. The flying sword pierced through the air. A hole appeared in the clouds, and then it gradually closed up. A faintly discernible red line remained in the air, emitting a faint smell of blood. The two didn't bid farewell to the crowd, and they didn't even say a word to Shiwang's son, which was a bit rude. However, there were too many things that had happened today. The shock in people's hearts hadn't dissipated yet, so they didn't think about this at all. Occasionally, people who thought about it even felt that this was the only way to fit the impression left by the young lady of Shinma Peak. Looking at the red line disappearing in the ocean wind, Xiang Wanshu murmured, "Is this the thoughtless sword left by the immortal?" When he said this, he was a little emotional. His clean face had an expression of admiration and yearning. The number of genius disciples in Zhongzhou school was even greater, and he was only one of them. He knew that the number of geniuses in the world was innumerable. What kind of person could be called a true genius? Only time would tell. Countless geniuses of the past had faded into obscurity because they had been obstructed at a cultivation juncture. Such incidents had happened too many times in the cultivation world. Who were the true peerless geniuses in the past few hundred years? Of course, it was the one who had walked the furthest. There had been only one ascendant in Chaotian over the last 1,000 years, and that was Jingyang. The more talented Xiang Wanshu was, the more he knew how great the immortal Jingyang was. Every time it was mentioned that Zhao Liu had inherited the legacy of Zhenren Jingyang, not to mention him, even his senior brother Tong Yen was a little envious. At this moment, the young monk from the Guoqing temple came to the old monk's side. He pointed at his mouth and whimpered, looking a little anxious. Some people found it strange, wondering if he was a mute. The practitioners who were familiar with the Guoqing temple had already guessed that the young monk was practicing silent meditation. The young monk was asking, "The two Oyama fellow Taoists have already left. Do I still need to practice silent meditation?" The old monk said, "It's done." The young monk felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at the red line in the sky that was about to disappear and said loudly. His voice was loud and clear, like the evening bell of an ancient temple, resounding through the cloud platform. "You came in high spirits and returned when your spirits are exhausted. You truly have the demeanor of an immortal." The demeanor of an immortal? I'm afraid it's the work of the devil Tao. The continent is about to welcome another disaster. Standing in Haizhou City, Shi Fengqian said expressionlessly as he watched the sword lights and magical treasures scatter in the sky. The subordinate didn't understand what he meant, thinking that they had caught an important figure of the Aoyama sect in the process of arresting the criminals that day, which was a great loss of face for the Pure Heaven Bureau. It was meaningless for the master to say such things. How could the populace think that the immortal masters of the Aoyama sect were demons? Shi Fengqian didn't explain. He said this because, in his opinion, Zhao Leo was very similar to a great figure in the cultivation world many years ago. That important figure had traveled around the world, and he advocated killing to stop the evildoers. The number of people killed by his sword was probably more than the number of people killed by Lian Sanyue. But in the end, that important figure fell into the demonic path and became the biggest disaster in the cultivation world. This was a real secret, and almost nobody in the cultivation world knew about it. Not many people in the Aoyama sect knew about it. Yet, he learned this secret from the former manager of the Pure Heaven Bureau by chance. He had made up his mind that he would use all the connections and resources he had accumulated in the first half of his life after returning to Zhaoga City, in order to obtain the opportunity to meet the emperor in the royal palace. If he could meet the emperor, he would find a way to make the emperor associate Zhao Leu with that evil person. Among the 9 peaks of Aoyama, Shanghai Peak was the coldest, Yunxing Peak was the most dangerous, Shenma Peak was the loneliest, and Tianguang Peak was the highest. In the early spring, everything was recovering. The trees on Tianguang Peak were already green and green. Looking around, one could see a pleasant green scene, which was very pleasing to the eye. A tall figure stood by the cliff's edge, looking at the scenery, exuding a cold aura. "I didn't expect he was still alive, and he came to you?" He wasn't talking to a human being, but a white cat with long hair. White Ghost, one of the 4 principal guards, left Bihu Peak for some reason and came here today. There was a monument on the top of Tianguang Peak, carried by a stone tortoise. The stone tortoise was very big, with a circumference of 100 feet. White Ghost squatted on the head of the stone tortoise, looking small in comparison. He didn't pay attention to what the man said, licking his hair and washing his face, doing it very seriously. "I've brought the message. As for why you two pretend not to know each other, it's none of my business." White Ghost was very curious about many things. There was a proverb in Aoyama that referred to this matter. The problem was another proverb, which he remembered more clearly: curiosity killed the cat. "I didn't arrange this, but I knew about it and supported it. Aoyama cultivates the sword, so it's necessary to wield the sword. Liangwang Peak exists for this reason. The passion of the younger generation can't be cooled down because of us. I know what he's worried about, but I believe that every generation is stronger than the last. What Master and he couldn't do, it doesn't mean that the kids nowadays can't do it." White Ghost didn't stop washing his face, but his line of sight passed through his front claws and fell on the figure. Looking at his back, it had a strong impulse. Should it try to launch a sneak attack? Just like that night on Bihu Peak 2 years ago, the temptation was too strong. White Ghost gave up the idea in the end, because he knew he couldn't defeat the figure. This annoyed White Ghost. He stopped washing his face and scratched the head of the stone tortoise. As the principal guard of Aoyama, he was very powerful, and his sharp claws were many times more powerful than most flying swords. On the top of Bihu Peak, he scratched Jingjiu and sent him flying into the lake thousands of feet away, making him recuperate for half a year. He obviously didn't hold back his strength, so wouldn't the stone tortoise be smashed into powder? That didn't happen. The stone tortoise didn't shatter, nor did it crack. There was no trace, not even a white mark. An ancient and leisurely breath appeared on the top of the cliff. The stone tortoise slowly opened its eyes, looking a little confused, as if it didn't know what had happened. It turned out to be a living creature. The person turned around. He was tall, had calm eyes, and had an unfathomable breath. He was the principal of Aoyama. How did the round turtle offend you? It was sleeping soundly, but you had to wake it up. White Ghost's claws could split mountains and lakes, and made the well of Shinma Peak cough for half a year, but now he could only wake up the stone tortoise. But he wasn't embarrassed. As a companion who had lived in Aoyama for thousands of years, White Ghost certainly knew that the opponent had thick skin and wouldn't get hurt. Because the opponent was also the principal guard of Aoyama, the round turtle. You're not embarrassed, but I, the principal of Aoyama, don't even have a sword. Isn't it a little embarrassing? The principal looked at the stone tablet on the back of the stone tortoise and said, "He's coming back anyway. If you really want to stop this, you can use this to exchange." The stone tablet was very wide, straight, and huge, like a hill that had been cut open. Its surface was very smooth, and there were no words on it. There was a sword stuck on the top of the stone tablet, like a young girl with a small hairpin on her head. Was that the legendary sword of inherited heaven? But if one looked closely, he would find that the sword had no hilt, and it was hollow in the middle. The sword of inherited heaven was not a sword, but a scabbard. A scabbard was called the sword of inherited heaven, so what kind of sword did it contain? Chapter 91. The Path to the Heavens is about to be published. According to the usual practice, I should write a speech at this time, expressing my fear and anticipation, thanking the editor and everyone for their help, and then canvassing for votes or something. But everyone should be able to feel that the new book, The Path to the Heavens, I really want to change some of the conventions or at least some of my habits. That's why I originally wanted to quietly publish it and let you guys pay for it without anyone noticing. In the end, I was criticized for not respecting the readers. I feel that I have always respected the readers. Although I often quarreled with the readers in the past and scolded each other, and I basically did not listen to the readers' suggestions, let alone pay attention to their criticism, I still feel that I respect the readers. Because I am really serious about writing books, and I have always insisted that I am worthy of everyone's subscription money. When I am working, my mental and other inputs are absolutely sufficient. You can say that my writing sucks, but that's a problem with my standards, but there is no problem with my attitude, except for some special moment. There are a lot of things around middle-aged men, so I won't go into detail. In any case, when I have the time and energy, I will seriously write. As for the words of gratitude, I want to keep them in my heart. I haven't done something like canvassing for votes for 2 to 3 years, so I'll just do it casually. I am not afraid of the results because the writing is not bad. I am really looking forward to it. Please subscribe to the original version, my friends. I have been writing books for more than 10 years, and so many books have been published, but I still hold on to the original idea. Whether it is recommendation votes or monthly votes, they are all feelings. If you vote, I will be very grateful. If you don't vote, I won't force you. Tips are completely unnecessary, but subscriptions, you really need to come. To be honest, I have long since passed the stage of relying on subscriptions to make a living, but I still value subscriptions very much. Why? Because subscriptions are the foundation of the development of web novels to this day, and also because developing the habit of subscribing to the original version is very helpful for more authors. Most importantly, I feel that this is something we should do. I won't say much else. I definitely won't promise to constantly update. The only promise I can make is that the path to the heavens will be very good. Finally, thank you sincerely. Chapter 92. The main sword of Tianguang Peak was the most powerful sword of the Aoyama sect. This sword had been lost a long time ago, and the so-called inherited heaven sword was only a sheath. Undoubtedly, this was the biggest secret of the Aoyama sect, and nobody knew about it except for the 9 peak masters. Zhao Lei still didn't know about it, because she left too suddenly, or maybe on purpose. She didn't know many secrets of the Aoyama sect. The disciples of Aoyama didn't know about it either. The external disciples of the South Pine Pavilion and the North Crane sect were still concerned about when they could reach the state of spiritual stability and become an inner sect disciple. The sword-washing disciples by the stream were most concerned about which peak master would choose them for the upcoming inherited sword competition. The inherited sword disciples of the peaks were most concerned about the sword trial, which was held every few years, and what rank they would get, and whether they would be qualified to participate in the plum meeting. There were over 40 inner sect disciples participating in the inherited sword competition, of which a dozen disciples from the South Pine Pavilion received the most attention. Zhao Lei was from the South Pine Pavilion, and so was Lu Shisui. In less than 10 years, the South Pine Pavilion had produced 2 disciples with natural Tao quality, but the evaluation and treatment of these 2 disciples were completely different in the 9 peaks of Aoyama. When the name of Lu Shisui was mentioned, the disciples of Aoyama didn't show the same admiration as before, but rather disdain and disappointment. Sometimes they would show some sympathy, but most of the time they were angry. When the name of Zhao Lei was mentioned, they became more excited than ever, and their admiration for her grew even stronger. Yao Songshan and Lin Yingliang had finally brought back the news of the master of Shenma Peak, who had been traveling for 2 years. It wasn't until now that the people of the 9 peaks of Aoyama knew where Zhao Lei had been and what she had done in the last 2 years. She had been killing demons and devils along the way. No matter which sect you were from, or the benefactor of the royal concubine, you would be killed as long as you committed an evil deed. Hearing these stories, the disciples of Aoyama couldn't help but feel proud and honored. What pleased the disciples of Aoyama the most was what had happened at the Four Seas banquet. The disciples of Aoyama didn't like the disciples of Western Sea Sword School because of their arrogance of the godly swordsman. In the eyes of the disciples of the Green Mountain, Zhao Lei had slapped the West Ocean sword sect in the face by killing someone in the Grand Hall of the Four Seas banquet, which was quite satisfying. The news that Jing Jiu and the Center sect had a duel at the plum meeting had spread far and wide, but even the colleagues of the Green Mountain didn't think Jing Jiu would win. It was because his opponent might be Tong Yen of the Center sect, the number 1 chess player in the world. Some disciples who didn't know what had happened at the time felt discontented, thinking that the Green Mountain would be suppressed by the Center sect if he were to lose to the other party. One afternoon, the sword-washing disciples finished half a day of homework and came to the stream to take a break. Taking advantage of the spring sun, they discussed something. With the inherited sword competition around the corner, the most popular topic among the disciples was naturally when Zhao Lei would come back and whether she would recruit disciples this time. Suddenly, a white cloud floated over from the blue sky. The atmosphere between heaven and earth changed slightly. Light and shadow intertwined on the peaks. The Aoyama formation opened up a passage. A flying sword rapidly flew over from the horizon, drawing a perfectly straight red line. There was a sudden silence by the stream, followed by an uproar. Mei Li, Lin Wuji, Gu Han, and the others came out of the Shijian pavilion upon hearing the noise. They looked up at the sky with different expressions. Someone yelled in surprise, "Big Sister Leo is back!" Its senior master Lei. A disciple corrected him. The thoughtless sword is even redder. It looks like blood. What are you afraid of? The sword of Aoyama is bound to be stained with blood. Senior Master Leu has been slaying demons and devils along the way, so of course her sword is redder. As the blood-red sword light retreated to the peak top, the monkeys screamed in the forest among the cliffs, followed by the sound of friction. It seemed that the monkeys were on their way to meet their master. The monkeys were very enthusiastic about the return of their master, showing that they missed him very much. Jingju felt a bit annoyed, thinking that these monkeys were becoming more and more like his relatives on Shiyue Peak. Zhao Leu went to the manor cave to take a bath and change clothes. The first thing Jingju did was to bring out the bamboo chair and lie on it. Without this chair, he had less time to sleep over the last 2 years. Besides the bamboo chair, he also forgot to bring a ceramic plate with him, which he took out now. Zhao Leu walked out of the manor cave while wiping her wet hair. She saw Jingju lying on the chair, holding a grain of sand in his hand and staring at the ceramic plate in a daze. She hadn't seen this scene for a long time. A hint of a smile flashed in her eyes. The grains of sand on the ceramic plate had covered nearly half of the surface of the plate. She remembered clearly that when they were by the cliff of sword washing, it should have been 1/3 of the plate. Judging from the time, what Jingjiu was doing should be more and more difficult as the game progressed. It was because of the ceramic plate and the grains of sand that she believed that playing chess was the easiest thing in the world for Jingjiu. Even Tong Yen was no match for him. As she was thinking of this, hurried footsteps could be heard in the cliffs. Gu Qing came to the peak top as quickly as he could. He didn't have the time to bow to Jingjiu. "The plum meeting?" he asked while looking at Jingjiu. Jingjiu uttered The expression on Gu Qing's face changed slightly as he asked again, "Tong Yen?" "If he goes," Zhao Lei said. Standing by the cliff's edge, Gu Qing thought about it seriously for a while, and then said to Jingjiu, "You have to win." Influenced by Jingjiu, Jingjiu talked less and less, but for some reason, those monkeys in the peaks didn't change at all. Jingjiu turned to Zhao Leu and said, "Look, his state of mind is indeed peaceful, stronger than yours and Lu Shisui's." Hearing Jingjiu praising him for being stronger than Zhao Leu, Gu Qing felt a bit uncomfortable. Thinking of Lu Shisui mentioned by Jingjiu, he said seriously, "He's having a hard time now. I went to see him once, but he didn't want to see me again. I think there's something wrong with his state of mind. You should go and have a look." Jingjiu didn't respond. Zhao Leu asked, "Are you sure he'll be fine?" Jingjiu dropped the grain of sand between his fingers, saying, "I'm sure it's his own choice." The inherited sword competition began on the 4th day after the two of them returned to Aoyama. The arrangement at the end of the stream of sword washing was the same as 3 years ago. It was probably because all the cultivation sects were preparing for the plum meeting that fewer guests came to watch the competition. No one from Guoqing Temple or Ozawa came, and that young girl from the Platonist sect didn't come either. The strange thing was that the Windy Broadsword sect, which didn't have a close relationship with the Aoyama sect, sent another messenger to the competition. The appearance of Zhao Leu and Jingjiu attracted a lot of attention. They had participated in the inherited sword competition 3 years ago, but they were by the stream then, and they were on the cliff this day. They were the disciples who were going to inherit the sword at that time, and now they were going to choose the disciples who would inherit the sword. Speaking of the fast promotion of status, it was rare to see such a situation in the last tens of thousands of years in Aoyama. This of course had something to do with the ascension of the immortal Jingyang. Looking at Zhao Leu and Jingjiu, many disciples of Aoyama, including the masters of the 2nd generation, couldn't help but feel envious or even jealous of them. But they were well aware that they didn't have the courage that Zhao Leu had 3 years ago, and they didn't have the ability to climb to the top of the Shima Peak. As such, their jealousy and resentment were all directed at Jingjiu. Apart from a few people, no one knew what had happened that night. Jingjiu didn't have any dealings with anybody, so he didn't have a chance to explain, and he was happy to see it happen. Zhao Liu understood his intention, so she didn't say anything. Like Jingjiu, she didn't see anybody. A disciple by the stream suddenly said, "Look, is he still carrying that iron sword on his back? It's the sword left by Senior Master Mo. It's wide and straight. I can't be wrong." Chapter 93. For the swordsmen of Aoyama, the state of the undefeated was the most important hurdle. Once they entered the state, they would have a lifespan several times longer than that of mortals, and they would be able to conceal their own energy with Dao magic. More importantly, their flying swords could be hidden in the sword pill, and when needed, they could come out with the discernment sword and kill people invisibly as fast as lightning. Back then, Master Mo and Master Lu were sent to the South Pine Pavilion to teach the external disciples because they couldn't enter the state of the undefeated and couldn't see a future in cultivation. It was not until they brought out Zhao Liu, Lu Shisui, and Jingjiu that they were specially summoned back to the peak to receive the magic medicine and continue to strive for a higher state. Jingjiu carrying the iron sword on his back meant that he hadn't entered the state of the undefeated. At his age, this was a normal thing. The problem was that his performance at the inherited sword competition 3 years ago shocked many people, so they naturally thought that he should have made a breakthrough after traveling for 3 years. Of course, this expectation was inevitably related to jealousy or envy. There are many precocious people who cultivate very fast at the beginning, but as their Dao magic becomes more and more difficult, their progress gradually slows down, or even stops. Looking at the cliff, Shuiyong-yi said with a sneer, "No progress in 3 years. I think he is this kind of person." After 3 years, Shuiyong-yi had completed the state of perfect preservation, and with the help of the granduncle of Shiriyue Peak, he entered the state of inherited will. He knew that he would be selected by Liangwang Peak and be taught the real sword, so he would catch up with or even surpass Jingjiu in the future. These were the thoughts of the ordinary disciples, but more people didn't think so. Most of the disciples at this age were below the state of inherited will, so there was no other explanation than jealousy for Jingjiu to have such a high requirement. The scene of Jingjiu defeating Gu Qing at the inherited sword competition 3 years ago was still vivid in people's minds. The sword way was based on the state, but it couldn't be completely relied on. Since entering the inner sect from the South Pine Pavilion, Jingjiu had brought too many surprises to Aoyama, so no one dared to make a rash judgment. Those people were more curious about why he showed up here. It was well known that he had never left Shima Peak when he was on Green Mountain. Lin Wuji looked at him in surprise and asked, "You're not in a daze on the peak, but you're here to watch the fun?" Jingjiu said, "I also want to accept disciples." He had only inherited the sword for 3 years, and now he wanted to accept a disciple? Lin Wuji felt that his words were ridiculous. He was about to laugh when he suddenly remembered that Jingjiu was now the second-generation teacher of Shinma Peak. Of course, he was qualified to accept disciples. But why did he still feel that it was ridiculous? The inherited will realm can also accept disciples? He asked uncertainly. Jingjiu said with certainty, "If the sect rules haven't been changed, then yes." The inherited sword competition began. The young disciples who had practiced hard by the stream of sword washing for 3 years came to the green stones in the stream according to the order on the registration list to show their swordsmanship. This year's inherited sword competition was the same as the previous years. It was also a stage for choosing and being chosen. Many things had been decided privately before the competition started. People in the peaks were whispering in small notebooks, and those disciples who were going to participate in the competition were looking at the cliff with expectant eyes, hoping to hear their names being called. Liangwang Peak and Tianguang Peak were still the places that the disciples wanted to go to the most. To his surprise, a few eager gazes came from a secluded corner of the cliff. Zhao Liu and Jingjiu were sitting there. They had just returned to Aoyama, so they had no time to contact the young disciples by the stream in advance. They didn't know where the enthusiasm of these young disciples came from. To the disappointment of those disciples, no voice came from that remote and quiet corner. After all, they didn't have the chance to become the inherited sword disciple of Shinma Peak. But they also felt relieved. What if it was Jingjiu who spoke? Were they going to become his disciple? A figure was reflected on the surface of the stream. The two sides of the valley, which had been quiet for 3 years, suddenly came the cries of monkeys again. The disciples of Aoyama were surprised and puzzled. Only Jingjiu knew that the monkeys came to cheer for their neighbors. It was Gu Qing who came to the stream. 3 years had passed. He had become a real young man. He looked calm and composed, with a calmness that didn't match his age. Looking at the figure in the stream, the cliffs suddenly became quiet. After a while, people began to discuss in low voices. Many people didn't forget what had happened 3 years ago. Gu Qing was defeated by Jingjiu. Later, he was expelled from Liangwang Peak for secretly learning the sword art. No one expected that he didn't waste 3 years by the stream, nor did he want to return to Liangwang Peak. Instead, he went directly to Shinma Peak. After that, he rarely showed up, as if he had disappeared. No one knew what Gu Qing had done during the 3 years in Shinma Peak. People could only be sure that he had completely fallen out with Liangwang Peak, or more precisely, with his elder brother Gu Han. In the eyes of many disciples, Gu Qing's choice was very unwise. Not to mention Liangwang Peak, the Gu family had a lot of resources among the 9 peaks. Even if you were a son of a concubine who had been bullied, and even if you had to stay in the stream of sword washing for another 3 years, why did you have to fall out with him? However, no one thought that Gu Qing couldn't pass the inherited sword art. He had already reached the state of inherited will 3 years ago. Even if he didn't make any progress in the past 3 years and was forbidden to use the 6-dragon sword spell, his state and strength must be far beyond those sword-washing disciples by the stream. People even guessed that he would choose Shinma Peak. But they didn't know how Liangwang Peak and senior brother Gu Han would react. Everyone knew the real reason why Gu Qing was expelled from Liangwang Peak, and they also knew that the relationship between Jingjiu and Gu Han was terrible. Many people subconsciously looked at the cliff where the disciples of Liangwang Peak were. Gu Han stood under a tree with an indifferent expression, and no one could tell what he was thinking. Shui Yongyi also looked at that place. Under the cover of many people's gazes, no one noticed that he and Gu Han looked at each other at a certain moment. Shui Yongyi understood what Gu Han meant. He took a deep breath and walked to the blue stone in the stream. Shui Yongyi didn't have the confidence to defeat Gu Qing. He was at the inherited will realm, but Gu Han had already reached the inherited will realm 3 years ago. But he believed that he could deal with Gu Han and show his progress to the masters in the cliff. At the same time, he could prove that Gu Qing's state of cultivation had stagnated in the past 3 years. Moreover, he had hidden skills. If Gu Qing underestimated him, he might really win. Wouldn't he be in the limelight today? Shui Yongyi called out his flying sword, stared at Gu Qing across the stream, and said, "Please." As soon as he finished speaking, the flying sword pierced through the air, leaving a residual shadow behind, and headed straight for Gu Qing's face. He had prepared himself for what he would do if Gu Qing dodged with his sword or counterattacked with his sword. But none of the things he had imagined happened. A crisp sound resounded through the mountain stream. Shui Yongyi's flying sword fell heavily into the stream like a stone, splashing water. Gu Qing raised the sword in his hand and checked it. He was relieved to make sure that the sword was not damaged. It was quiet on the cliff. The stream kept flowing, washing Shui Yongyi's sword. For some reason, many people felt this scene was familiar. Lin Wuji also felt it was familiar. The disciples of Liangwang Peak were the most sensitive to this scene. Chapter 94. How could this be possible? Shui Yong-yi stood in the stream with his hands empty, shocked, speechless. He didn't expect to defeat Gu Qing easily, but in his imagination, this sword fight would be very intense and exciting, and the winner would not be determined until the end. Even if he lost, it would be an honorable defeat, and he would be envied by his peers at the Hall of Sword Washing and praised by his masters. Who could have imagined such an ending? Gu Qing didn't take the opportunity to attack him. He stood by the stream in silence with his sword in his hand. Shui Yong-yi finally came to his senses. He felt his face burning. The strong sense of humiliation made him forget the story that had happened 3 years ago. He let out a shout. The flying sword in the stream suddenly flew up again. The stream water turned into white mist instantly, and a dozen flames ignited on the body of the sword. The burning flying sword hacked toward Gu Qing with a scorching heat wave. The six-dragon sword style. Shui Yong-yi's granduncle was an elder of Shiriyue Peak, and he had learned this sword style secretly. Though his six-dragon sword style wasn't as powerful as Gu Qing's 3 years ago, how could Gu Qing deal with it when he couldn't use the real swords of the peaks? No one noticed that Gu Qing's left hand had already landed on the hilt of his sword. The burning sword was coming. Gu Qing bent his left knee slightly, turned his body slightly, tightened his chest and abdomen, and struck the sword in the air with all his might. The method he used wasn't hacking, stabbing, or cutting. It was waving. His sword hit Shui Yong-yi's flying sword accurately. There was a loud bang. Shui Yong-yi's flying sword landed in the wild forest of the valley a few thousand feet away, leaving a long fiery tail behind. A few flames sprang up in the wild forest, but they were extinguished for some reason. Countless surprised screams rang out by the stream. Gu turned around and left. Everyone remembered why the scene looked so familiar. The same scene had happened here 3 years ago. Looking at the remote corner on the cliff, Lin Wuji shook his head with a smile. He thought it was Jing Jiu's arrangement, but he didn't know it was Gu Qing's own decision. Pick yourself up from where you fell. How to fall, how to climb up. The cheerful cries of the monkeys rang out in the valley. It turned out that they were the ones who put out the fire in the forest, and now they were fighting over the swords. Shui Yong-yi stood in the stream. His face was pale and he was in a daze. He didn't think about his sword at all, nor did he care about his failure. He finally came to his senses and remembered what had happened 3 years ago. He began to worry that he would lose the right to inherit a sword like Gu Qing because he secretly learned the sword art. No sound came from the cliff. It was common for the masters of the 9 peaks of Aoyama to pass the true sword to their favorite disciples in advance. No one would care about it. If Shanghai Peak and Tianguang Peak had not gone against each other 3 years ago, Gu Qing would not have been sacrificed. Shui Yong-yi didn't dare to stand there anymore. He hurriedly retreated back to the stream. His whole body was soaked, but he didn't know whether it was the stream water or his cold sweat. Gu Qing stood in the stream. Hundreds of people looked at him from the cliff. Gu Qing, are you willing to learn the sword from me? A voice suddenly rang out. It was the Yunqing Peak master himself. What was more shocking was that Elder Bai Rujing of Tianguang Peak also stood out and wanted to take Gu Qing as his disciple. No one noticed that in a corner of the cliff, Jing Jiu's eyes became colder when Bai Rujing stood out. Gu Qing said without hesitation, "Your disciple is willing to inherit the sword from Shenma Peak." Countless eyes fell on that corner of the cliff, or more precisely, on Zhao Lei. Many people had guessed it, but they didn't expect Gu Qing would still insist on this choice, even though he was favored by 2 seniors in the Broken Sea State. Zhao Lei was 1 year younger than him. Everyone thought Gu Qing would become Zhao Lei's disciple in the next moment. But something unexpected happened. Jing Jiu said, "Let me do it." Zhao Lei said, "Okay." Jing Jiu walked to the edge of the cliff and said, "Are you willing to learn the sword from me?" Hearing this, there was an uproar in the cliff. If it were Zhao Lei who took Gu Qing as her disciple, it would be fine, because she was already in the state of the undefeated. More importantly, she was the master of Shenhua Peak. Jingzhou's talent in swordsmanship was naturally very high, but he didn't make any progress in the past 3 years, and he was still in the state of inherited will. He was even worse than Gu Qing 3 years ago. How could Gu Qing be willing to take him as his teacher? As people were thinking about this, they heard Gu Qing's answer. I'm willing. Gu Qing's expression was calm, without any reluctance. It was quiet all around. The inherited sword competition continued. The disciples all performed very well, especially the young Yuan from Lelong Commandery. He was usually very low-key, but today he surprised everyone. Not until then did the masters know that he had entered the state of inherited will in advance, which caused a lot of discussion and competition. Even Liang Wang Peak expressed interest in him. Zhao Lei looked at Jingzhou and said, "Is he the one?" Jingzhou nodded. 3 years ago, young Yuan asked Gu Qing if Shenhua Peak wanted to take in an inherited sword disciple. Zhao Lei walked to the edge of the cliff. The quarrel in the cliff suddenly disappeared. A happy smile appeared on young Yuan's face. Suddenly, a sobbing sound came from the stream. The disciples looked over and found it was junior sister Yushan. Seeing the tears on the girl's face, her peers felt sorry for her and comforted her. "What's wrong?" Junior sister Yushan shook her head and wiped her tears with her sleeve. She forced a smile and said, "Nothing." Looking at her slightly red nose, the disciples were very confused, thinking to themselves, "How is this fine? What exactly is going on?" Some people looked at the young Yuan standing on the cliff and thought he had guessed something, so they smiled without saying anything. They didn't know that junior sister Yushan was not sad because of this. She was sad because senior brother Gu and senior brother Yuan had become the inherited sword disciples of Shenhua Peak. Then, Shenhua Peak was full. Shenhua Peak only had Zhao Lei and Jingzhou, so it could only take in 2 inherited sword disciples. But she hadn't shown up yet. What should she do? Should she wait in the stream of sword washing for another 3 years? Now it was her turn. Holding the sword, she walked to the green stone in the stream and saluted to the masters in the cliff. When her sight fell on that corner, she couldn't help but sniff again. That corner looked so pitiful and cute. Although she was not in the right mood, Yushan's performance was very outstanding. Her realm was not extraordinary, but what was extraordinary was the absolute control she revealed when she controlled and flew the sword. Even the smallest details were done perfectly. Her precision could even be said to be perfect. Seeing the tear stains on the young girl's face, Mei Li felt both pity and joy. She walked to the cliff's edge and said, "Come to Qingrong Peak." Qingrong Peak was mostly filled with female disciples, so it was the best place for junior sister Yushan. Unexpectedly, junior sister Yushan didn't agree directly, but looked at that corner on the cliff instead. In the shadow of the tree, Jingzhou shook his head imperceptibly. Yushan was taken aback. She looked at senior master Mei Li again and shook her head apologetically. There was another uproar in the cliff. Jingzhou said to young Yuan, "Tell her to choose Shangda Peak." Gu Qing didn't understand, wondering how he could be sure that Shangda Peak would choose junior sister Yushan. Shangda Peak was extremely cold and gloomy, and there hadn't been a female disciple there for many years because of the sword jail and the temperament of the peak. Young Yuan returned to the stream's edge and said something to junior sister Yushan in a low voice. It was then that Qi Yan of Shangda Peak came out and asked, "Are you willing to learn the sword work with me?" Junior sister Yushan nodded after a moment of hesitation. Mei Li was quite annoyed and she turned around and glared at Jingzhou. Like senior master Mei Li, the female disciples of Qingrong Peak had a good impression of Jingzhou, but they were also angry at the moment. Everyone could tell that junior sister Yushan had chosen Shangda Peak according to Jingzhou's suggestion, though they didn't understand why she listened to Jingzhou. Jingzhou didn't pay attention to these gazes. He looked at the cliff in silence. That guy was nowhere to be found, no matter where the disciples of Liangwang Peak or Tianguang Peak were. Chapter 95. In the evening, the sword-washing stream reflected the sunset glow, looking like a red ribbon. It was quite lively among the cliffs. The monkeys had already returned Shui Yong-Yi's sword, so they weren't the ones making a fuss. Many disciples were packing their luggage, and they would go to the 9 peaks later to start a new life. In a cozy stone cave, young Yuan couldn't help but sigh after packing his luggage and glancing at young sister Yushan, who was still unhappy. You should listen to the masters when you go to Shangda Peak. Don't throw a tantrum. I don't want to go there, young sister Yushan said with a wronged expression. Then she thought of the rumors, feeling a bit scared, asking, "Is Senior Master Sword Justice really that formidable?" Young Yuan comforted her. "Big Brother Jing won't let you suffer a loss if he asks you to go there." "That's true." Young sister Yushan thought of something and said, "You should call him Senior Master Jing, don't always forget it." Young Yuan said, "I know." From the South Pine Pavilion to the sword-washing stream, the two of them had been instructed by Jingjiu a few times. Jingjiu's identity had changed from young brother Jing to big brother Jing, and now he was Senior Master Jing. Young sister Yushan was not happy that she couldn't go to Shinma Peak, but she was happy that Jingjiu had instructed her in the end. "Can I go there?" she asked. Young Yuan knew what she meant, but he didn't dare agree directly, saying, "I have to ask my master first." The Shinma Peak under the setting sun looked like a burning sword. Standing by the cliff's edge, Jingjiu looked at the distant Shangda Peak, lost in thought. He had often looked at that place before he left Aoyama. Zhao Leu came to his side and asked, "Why don't you let her go to Qingrong Peak?" Jingjiu didn't answer her, thinking it was inappropriate to tell others the reason for his conflict with Qingrong Peak. Zhao Leu asked again, "Why don't you take young Yuan as your disciple?" Jingjiu said, "I've never accepted a disciple, but I heard that I have to beat him hard. For some reason, I can't do it." So, he asked Zhao Leu to come forward just to make it easier for young Yuan to be beaten. Young Yuan heard this as soon as he arrived at the peak. He stared at Jingjiu, wondering what he had done wrong. The monkeys were making a lot of noise in the forest. Then they brought Gu Qing up. Young Yuan repeated junior sister Yushan's words. Gu Qing said with a smile, "Of course. I've lived here for 3 years and no one cared." Young Yuan was at a loss, thinking, "Do we have the final say in this matter?" Gu Qing thought to himself, "You'll know in the future. Speaking of which, what's your name?" Hearing this question, even Zhao Leu was interested. To this day, people only knew that he was the youth surnamed Yuan from Lelong Commandery, but they didn't know his full name. Young Yuan answered honestly, "Yuan Qinhu." Gu Qing felt this name was familiar. He suddenly thought of something and said, "Senior Uncle Sword Justice's surname is also Yuan." Young Yuan was taken aback and said, "Yes, what a coincidence." Gu Qing said, "This name is similar to Senior Uncle Sword Justice's name, but the difference is too big. One was riding a whale and the other was catching a tiger. Of course they were different." Young Yuan thought for a while and said to Zhao Leu, "May I ask for a name from my master?" It was common for a disciple to be given a name by a master in the Aoyama sect and other sections. Gu Qing said, "How about Yuan Pohei?" Using the state of Broken Sea as a name was indeed impressive, but also a bit. Zhao Lei glanced at him and said, "How about Yuan Tongtian?" Gu Qing knew he was too happy today and talked too much. He patted young Yuan's shoulder and signaled him to follow him to the small building outside the cliff cave. They would live here from now on, and the wooden hut at the foot of the cliff would be left to the monkeys. "How about you give him a name?" Zhao Lei said to Jingjiu. Before returning to Aoyama, Jingjiu and Zhao Lei went to the small village. She learned some stories that had happened that year, and also learned that it was he who gave the name to Lu Shisui. Jingjiu shook his head. The inherited sword competition was soon forgotten, because Aoyama was going to host a truly grand event this year. The sword trial of Aoyama was nominally to select the best young disciples to participate in the plum meeting next year, but it was actually a competition among the peak. Aoyama always encouraged this kind of competition. Even if the disciples failed in the sword trial, they would still have the opportunity to enter Liangwang Peak as long as they performed well. They could choose any of the sword styles of the 9 peaks to practice. This was a rare opportunity for the young disciples, so they all signed up for it. Looking at the sword lights falling down toward Tianguang Peak from the distant sky, young Yuan showed an envious expression. He had just become a disciple of Shinma Peak, so he wasn't qualified to participate in the sword trial of Aoyama. It would take at least a few more years. "Do you really want to go?" asked Gu Qing while looking at him. Young Yuan said, "I don't dare to think about the plum meeting, but it would be great if I could enter Liangwang Peak to learn those sword styles." "Have you forgotten the relationship between us and Liangwang Peak?" asked Gu Qing. Young Yuan suddenly realized that he had witnessed the conflict between Jing Jiu and Gu Han at the stream of sword washing. "Of course I won't go," he said hurriedly. Gu Qing said, "Believe me, Shinma Peak is your best choice. What Liangwang Peak has can be found here." Young Yuan didn't quite understand what Jingzhu meant, wondering if the big brothers and sisters of Liangwang Peak could learn any sword style of the 9 peaks at will. Could it be the same in Shinma Peak? An object drifted out of the cave and slowly drifted to the front of young Yuan. He caught it reflexively and found it to be a thin booklet. "Congratulations," said Gu Qing with a smile while looking at him. Young Yuan was confused. He opened the thin booklet and was startled by what he saw. There were 8 words written on the first page of the booklet. "Standing proudly in the snow and frost, 7 apricot is invincible." Both Gu Qing and young Yuan were famous people, so they knew what it was. It was the unreal sword style of Shilai Peak of 7 apricot. Young Yuan was shocked. Thinking that this sword style could subdue the snow-flowing sword style of Shangda Peak, his face turned even paler. Gu Qing knew that he was overthinking, saying, "Masters don't have such a deep meaning in their actions." Young Yuan asked nervously, "Then why teach me this sword style?" "Who knows? Maybe he just wants to make sure you won't be bullied too badly by Sister Yushan in the future?" While the two were talking, a red light suddenly illuminated the top of the peak, overshadowing all the sunglow in the sky. A sword light left the peak and flew into the distance with a sudden gust of wind. The sword test of Aoyama was about to begin. Jing Jiu and Zhao Leia would go to Tianguang Peak. Seeing the blood-red line left by the thoughtless sword in the sky, Gu Qing suddenly had a bad feeling about what was going to happen. He prayed silently, hoping that nothing serious would happen today. Naming is indeed difficult. Everyone knows my name is terrible, but my chapter name is as good as ever. Chapter 96. The location of the sword trials in Aoyama was Tianguang Peak, or more accurately, the Sword Forest. The Sword Forest was a stone forest, and it was formed by hundreds of stone pillars. These stone pillars were about 10 feet thick, but they were more than 1,000 feet tall. They were like countless giant swords pointing towards the sky, and it looked exceptionally magnificent. Many of the disciples who participated in the sword trial of Aoyama for the first time also saw the stone forest from such a close distance. They were shocked, but they were nervous when they thought about how they would have to stand on top of the stone pillars and compete with their peers. Different from the inherited sword competition, the sword trial of Aoyama was more like a real battle, which was much more dangerous. Every time, there would be many injured disciples, and many of them were seriously injured. It was said that many years ago, during the sword trial of Aoyama, some disciples even died on the spot. Due to these reasons and the fact that they did not want the outside world to know their true strength, Aoyama sect had never invited other sects to attend their ceremonies, not even the sects like Guoqing Temple, Shueiyu Nunnery, and Ozawa, who had been friends for thousands of years. Hundreds of disciples came to the surroundings of the sword forest and did not make a single sound. A wide and straight black sword hung in the air above the stone platform in silence, emitting a bone-piercing chill in all directions. This was the main sword of Shangda Peak, the 3-foot sword. Today, Yuan Qijing would personally oversee the meeting. Thinking up to this point, the breathing of the disciples seemed to have frozen, and they didn't dare to make any noise. So. The sound of something tearing through the air kept ringing. Several beams of sword light illuminated the hundreds of stone pillars in the mountains, scattering countless rays of light. The 6 flying swords slowly descended and lined up behind the 3-foot sword. Some swords were simple and cold, some were sharp, and some were like thunder. 3-foot sword, absolute void sword, zither sword, returning sun sword, time sword, tide sword, and the thoughtless sword. Looking at this scene, the hundreds of disciples finally couldn't control themselves any longer, and they started discussing with excited expressions. The main swords of Aoyama's peaks, 7 out of 9. Such a scene had not appeared for many years. Countless gazes fell on those famous swords. The blood-red flying sword, which was ranked last, received the most attention and made many people sigh with emotion. Some of the white-haired elders even felt as if a lifetime had passed. Perfected Jingyang never participated in the affairs of the sect, so the thoughtless sword rarely appeared. The last time the thoughtless sword appeared on such an occasion, the leader of Aoyama sect was still Taiping Jinren, and Yuan Qijing had just taken over as the leader of Shanghai Peak. How many years ago was that? There were 9 stone platforms between the cliffs opposite the sword forest. These 9 stone platforms were the seats for the elders of the 9 peaks. Only the second platform was occupied by the disciples of Liangwang Peak led by Guananshan. To show respect to the masters, the disciples of Liangwang Peak didn't have seats and would stand all the time. Many gazes landed on the 9th stone platform. Zhao Lei had arrived. No matter whether she greeted the peak masters or the elders as equals or received the greetings from the disciples, her expression was calm, showing no discomfort or awkwardness. The peak master of Qingrong thought that her temperament was much better than that of the regular disciples, similar to that of her young senior master. It seemed that she deserved it. As she looked at Jingjiu by Zhao Lei's side, the expression in her eyes became complicated. Many elders also had complicated feelings about Jingjiu, though their feelings were not the same as those of the peak master of Qingrong. In some people's eyes, Jingjiu was still very young, so it was normal that he hadn't entered the state of the undefeated, but he was still a bit weaker than Zhao Lei and Zhuoruzhui, who was still behind closed doors. It was said that Zhuoruzhui had already entered the upper state of the undefeated, and it was very likely that he would have entered the state of free travel when he came out from behind closed doors, which would shock the whole land. But most elders of the 9 peaks didn't think so. Jingjiu had only fought once, and that was when he defeated Gu Qing at the inherited sword competition 3 years ago. It was that fight that convinced many elders that this young disciple was definitely a talented swordsman. At this year's inherited sword competition, the sword style Gu Qing used was obviously from Jingjiu, which was why the peak master of Yunqing wanted to take Jingjiu as his disciple. Until now, those elders had remained silent and hadn't made any comments on Jingjiu, because they didn't want to attract the attention of other sects, especially Zhongzhou school. They hoped that Jingjiu would become the unexpected soldier of the Aoyama sect in the future. After knowing the agreement between Jingjiu and Zhongzhou school at the Four Seas banquet, they looked forward to seeing how Jingjiu would perform at next year's plum meeting. Couldn't he defeat Tong Yen on the Go board? They didn't care. Whether Jingjiu could defeat his peers from Zhongzhou school was what they cared about. The arrangement of the matches at the sword trial was decided by drawing lots, until the final 10 winners would be selected to represent the Aoyama sect at next year's plum meeting. If one encountered a big brother of Liangwang Peak in the first round, it could only be said that one had bad luck. The competition of swordsmanship emphasized that everything in the world was contained in the sword, and luck was one of the factors. Nobody dared to cheat in the drawing of lots. Though the sword jail on the Shangda Peak locked up countless demons and devils, nobody knew how many empty rooms there were in the jail. Qi Yuanliang had bad luck. He had inherited the sword only 3 years ago, and he was ranked first in today's first sword trial of Aoyama. To make matters worse, his opponent was Yao Songshan. 2 flashes of sword light left the ground. Yao Songshan and Qi Yuanliang landed on 2 stone posts, facing each other with a distance of more than 1,000 feet. The top of the stone posts was a few thousand feet above the ground, with clouds and fog shrouding the bottom. If it were an ordinary person, he would fall to his death with his legs weakened. Qi Yuanliang of course knew that he was no match for this 11th big brother of Liangwang Peak, but a disciple of Aoyama couldn't give up the fight. He forced himself to calm down and said bravely, "Please." Without any mishap, Yao Songshan won. Later, other disciples flew up to the sword forest one after another, starting the sword fights. Compared to the inherited sword competition, the sword trial of Aoyama was much more exciting, and of course much more dangerous. The violent and dense sword lights traveled at a high speed among the stone posts, reaching into the clouds, scraping the stone chips off from time to time. Even with the protection of the formation, the disciples could still hear the ear-piercing sounds of the flying swords piercing through the air, and sense the formidable sword wills. When the fights became more intense, the 2 sides would ride their swords away from the original stone posts, fighting on the swords. Thunder and lightning and flames would appear from time to time. The disciples stared at the high-speed sword lights and figures in the stone forest. They didn't want to miss anything. The masters of the peaks were also watching the disciples' fights with serious expressions, ready to rescue them at any time. In a sword fight like this, neither side could hold back. At the critical moment, it would be difficult to stop even if they wanted to. Jingjiu's eyes were not on the stone forest. He was looking at a mountain path in the distance. The mountain path was narrow, disappearing in the fog, leading to an unknown place. He knew that the residence of the disciples of Tianguang Peak was around the cliff. Lu Shisui lived there. Chapter 97. 2 disciples stood on the stone pillars, separated by more than 100 feet. The younger one came from Bihu Peak and was in the upper state of inherited will. The middle-aged disciple came from Tianguang Peak and was the second disciple of Elder Mo. He had already broken through the state of undefeated. The gap between states was hard to make up. 3 years ago, Jingjiu defeated Gu Qing in the stream of sword washing, which was a rare occurrence. The flying sword of a disciple in the state of inherited will could move freely within 100 feet, but the killing range of a disciple in the state of undefeated was several times that. Logically speaking, the disciple of Bihu Peak had no chance of winning, but how could he admit defeat? A bright sword light crossed the distance of more than 100 feet and arrived in front of him. Unable to fight back, the disciple of Bihu Peak could only ride his sword to avoid the danger. His sword source spun rapidly and flew forward as fast as he could. He had to shorten the distance between him and his opponent in order to exert the power of his flying sword. The bright sword light turned back and chopped down again. The disciple of Bihu Peak rode his sword into the clouds below the stone forest and once again narrowly avoided this attack. The bright sword light brushed past the stone pillars, bringing up stone chips like a light rain. Seeing this scene, there was a burst of exclamations below the stone forest. People appreciated the courage of the disciple of Bihu Peak, but they were also worried about his safety. It was very dangerous to ride a sword through the clouds and mist, and one could crash into a stone pillar at any time. "Here it comes!" Someone suddenly shouted. Somewhere in the clouds and mist suddenly bulged. The disciple of Bihu Peak rode his sword and was only about 100 feet away from his senior brother of Tianguang Peak. He was surrounded by clouds and mist, and there was a faint flash of lightning. He was already prepared in the clouds, condensing all the sword energy in his body for this final strike. Seeing this scene, the disciple of Tianguang Peak showed a trace of appreciation in his eyes. He was not nervous at all. He put his 2 fingers together and used the sword formula again. The bright sword light suddenly appeared above the clouds and mist, as if it had been waiting there. The disciple of Bihu Peak had no time to react. He forcibly turned his sword and crashed into a stone pillar. A muffled sound rang out. The stone pillar stood there unmoving. That disciple's face was covered in blood, unconscious as he fell towards the ground. Before his master could come to his rescue, a disciple of Tianguang Peak stepped on his sword and caught him before he fell into the clouds. There was a burst of cheers from the peak. The first round of the sword trial had already entered the middle stage. In the sword trial that had ended, the disciples of Tianguang Peak and Bihu Peak had the best performances. Similar to the previous years, Yunxing Peak had a good record as well, but Shilai Peak and Shuriwe Peak weren't good at sword fights, so the disciples of the 2 peaks had only won 3 matches in total. Surprisingly, Qingrong Peak had a terrible performance this year. All 7 female disciples they sent had lost. The masters of Shuriwe Peak were there to treat those disciples who had lost. Though those disciples were a bit disappointed, they didn't show much negative emotion on their faces. The disciples who won didn't show any arrogance. After all, it was a competition between disciples of the same sect. Besides, except for Yao Songzhan, the other disciples of Liangwang Peak hadn't shown up yet. Next, a tall figure walked into the field, causing some discussions. This tall disciple was Jian Rushan, ranked 46th on Liangwang Peak. He was more famous because he was Jian Ruoyun's younger brother. Jian Ruoyun, ranked 4th on Liangwang Peak, was undoubtedly a swordsman among the disciples of the 3rd generation. He had a high level of sword work and was respected by his peers. 2 years ago, when Lu Shisui was sent back to Aoyama in a coma by the Muddy River, Jian Ruoyun, the leader of the team, was punished by Shangda Peak and imprisoned in the stone room for half a year for his incompetence. Many people thought it was unreasonable at the time. After Lu Shisui woke up, he was suspected of having eaten the Dace Devil pill. The disciples felt that Jian Ruoyun had been wronged, and felt indignant for him. Jian Rushan's cultivation state was not as good as his elder brother's, but he had a place on Liangwang Peak, so he couldn't be underestimated. Many disciples were wondering who had such bad luck to draw the 2nd disciple of Liangwang Peak. Jian Rushan suddenly said, "I want to name a name." Hearing this, the disciples were a bit surprised. The sword trial in Aoyama was carried out according to the order of drawing lots, but there was an exception, which was the challenge by name. Since it was a challenge by name, no one dared to choose a peer who was weaker than him, so he would only choose an opponent whose cultivation state was generally higher than him. Who was Jian Rushan going to challenge by name? People noticed that he had fixed his eyes on the 9 stone platforms on the cliffs, wondering if he was going to challenge a senior brother of the same peak. Those sitting on the stone platforms were all masters of the peaks, and only the disciples of Liangwang Peak could be chosen. Looking at the farthest stone platform, Jian Rushan said expressionlessly, "I want to name Senior Uncle Jingjiu." The crowd was in an uproar. Jian Rushan paused for a long time between the words Jingjiu and Senior Uncle on purpose, and everyone could sense his hostility. Many disciples remembered the rumor that Jingjiu and Lu Shisui used to be a master and a servant. Did Jian Rushan want to avenge his elder brother? Countless eyes fell on Jingjiu. Jingjiu didn't respond, still looking at the mountain path in the distance. Jian Rushan sneered and said, "What? Senior Uncle Jing doesn't dare to accept the challenge?" Qi Yan walked out and said in a deep voice, "Do you want to offend your superior?" As an elder of Shangda Peak, he had the right to veto the challenge by name according to the sect rules. But the disciples were not convinced. No one knew the real cultivation state of Jingjiu, but he was recognized as a genius in swordsmanship, and more importantly, he was the senior uncle. Therefore, there was no problem for Jian Rushan to challenge him. Jingjiu still didn't pay attention to him, looking at the mountain path in the distance. Being ignored, Jian Rushan was very angry, thinking that Yi Qingyu was trying to get away with it. Feeling even more shameless, he said, "You—" He was interrupted before he finished his words. A weird sound came from the mountain path in the distance. The sound was very harsh, like two swords colliding and rubbing against each other. The disciples looked in the direction of the sound. A figure appeared on the mountain path. That person was very thin, and his sword robe was shabby, fluttering in the wind. As he walked, the disciples saw his face clearly. That person's face was pale, his eyes were deep, and his hair was like weeds. The strange thing was that there were no shackles on his feet, but when he walked, there would be a sound of metal rubbing between the soles of his shoes and the blue stone. There was a burst of exclamations around the stone forest. Lu Shui. Why is he here? It had been 2 years. He had been in the stone room behind the cliff of Tianguang Peak, and had never come out. The natural Taoist quality was gradually forgotten. But today, he suddenly appeared in front of everyone. He was like a ghost. Zhao Leo's expression turned slightly serious. The expressions of the elders changed slightly. They heard one thing from that sound. There was a sword sound when he walked. That was the sign of the body of sword will. Zhao Leo had practiced hard in Sword Peak for many years before she succeeded in practicing the body of sword will. How did Lu Shui do it when he was imprisoned in the stone room on Tianguang Peak? Zhao Leo looked at Jingjiu, wanting to know his reaction and to get an answer. But Jingjiu was concerned about something else. He murmured, "How can that little black face be so pale? How many days has it been since he went out in the sun?" Hello students, I would like to recommend a new book to everyone. The book is called The Great Path Toward Heaven. Ah no, it's Demon Ye Wushuang. Please support me, everyone. Chapter 98. Under the shocked gazes of the crowd, Lu Shui came to the field. He lowered his head, and his weedy hair covered his eyes, looking like a criminal. "What are you doing here?" Elder Bai Rujing scolded him sternly, his expression terrible. As an elder in the broken sea state of Tianguang Peak, he had taught a wicked disciple who ate the devil pill. It was the most humiliating thing he had ever experienced in his life. Lu Shui said hoarsely without raising his head, "This disciple wants to take part in the sword trial." The expression on Bai Rujing's face grew even colder as he yelled, "What qualification do you have to take part in the sword trial? Get out of here right now." "Master, I'm also a disciple of Aoyama. Why can't I take part in the sword trial?" Lu Shui's head was still lowered, and his voice was still as hoarse. Seeing his current appearance and hearing his voice, many disciples felt sympathetic for him. The female disciples on Qingrong Peak felt even more sentimental. Jian Ruoshan said to Lu Shui with a sneer, "You ate the devil pill secretly back then, which caused my elder brother to be imprisoned, and you have committed other serious crimes. If the masters hadn't found the evidence, your cultivation would have been abolished, and you would have been expelled from the mountain gate a long time ago. But you still have the nerve to come out and ask why." Lu Shui didn't respond to him, waiting for Bai Rujing's answer. Jian Rushan suddenly laughed and said mockingly, "Since you want to take part in the sword trial, and I happen to be here, why don't we have a match?" Having said that, he called out his flying sword. It was a flying sword made of black gold, about 2.5 feet long, making a buzzing sound and vibrating at a speed that couldn't be seen clearly by the naked eye. Lu Shui suddenly waved his hand. His shabby sleeve created a series of residual shadows. A violent wind sprang up. A few green lights shot out from his sleeve, heading toward Jian Rushan. A crisp sword chime could be heard. The black gold sword flew away diagonally. Pop, 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 pop. Jian Rushan was knocked back 100 feet and hit the cliff wall, spitting out a mouthful of fresh blood, unable to stand up again. A few visible cracks appeared on his body. The sword force. The separation sword. There was a burst of surprised screams. Some of the teachers stood up in shock. Even an important figure like the peak master of Qingrong had a grave expression on his face. Be it the astral sword or the parting sword, they were both extremely difficult to cultivate because there was a prerequisite. Yes, Lu Shisui's tempered body of sword intent wasn't at the beginner level, but it had already reached the mastery level. Nobody came to the quiet stone house on Tianguang Peak to explore, and there weren't as many swift and fierce sword wills as on Yunxing Peak. But in his heart there was a wildfire called unwillingness. That wildfire burned for 2 whole years, making him unable to sleep at night. How dare you launch a sneak attack? Bai Rujing was furious to the extreme, and he shouted, "I'll cripple you today." A melodramatic drama of master and disciple killing each other was about to unfold, but someone stopped it. "Elder Bai, please wait," Qi Yan said expressionlessly. "I saw it very clearly. It was Jian Rushan who challenged him, and it was Jian Rushan who attacked first. How could you say that Lu Shisui launched a sneak attack?" According to the rules of the sword trial in Aoyama, once either side summoned their flying swords, it meant that the competition could begin. Qi Yan was an elder of Shangda Peak, so his explanation of the sect rules couldn't be wrong. But the question was, why did he speak up for Lu Shisui? It took the disciples a while to figure it out. It must have something to do with the dispute between the two peaks. The people of Shanghai Peak should be the happiest when Tianguang Peak had such a sinful disciple as Lu Shisui. In Aoyama, the relationship between Tianguang Peak and Shanghai Peak had always been complicated. Everyone knew the reason, but no one dared to say it. The peak heads and elders on the stone platform all remained silent, and the disciples didn't dare to make a sound. "You're right. As long as you're not expelled from the mountain gate, you're a disciple of Aoyama, and you're qualified to participate in the sword trial." Qi Yan looked at Lu Shisui and said expressionlessly, "But you should know that the drawing of lots has been over for a long time." Lu Shisui said with his head lowered, "I'd like to name a name." Since Jian Rushan could name a person, so could he. After a moment of silence, Qi Yan asked, "Who do you want to name?" Lu Shisui lifted his head and looked at a spot in the cliff. His eyes were bright, which couldn't be concealed by his messy hair that looked like weeds. "Jian Ruiyun, Big Brother." An uproar broke out again. The disciples around the stone forest were stunned. 2 years ago, it was because Lu Shisui ate the devil pill secretly and fell into a coma that Jian Ruiyun was implicated and locked up in the stone room for half a year. Now, Lu Shisui didn't think about his own mistakes and wanted to challenge Jian Ruiyun. It was ridiculous. Did he think it was Jian Ruiyun's fault that he had ended up like this? As the sword light flickered, Jian Ruiyun came to the scene. He looked at Lu Shisui and said sentimentally, "Young brother Lu, why did you do this? Do you think it's my fault? It's true that I underestimated you and let you make a big mistake, but it was you who made the mistake." Lu Shisui snapped angrily, "Did I? Was I really the one who made the mistake?" The expression on Jian Ruiyun's face changed slightly. Lu Shisui stared into his eyes and said, "You know what had happened the best, but you've never told me that it was obviously, it's useless to say more. Now that you think it's my fault, come at me. But I have to tell you that you're no match for me even if you ate the devil pill." Jian Ruiyun suddenly interrupted him. For some reason, his face was a bit pale. After a moment of silence, Lu Shisui said, "Yeah, I've said this many times in the last 2 years, but nobody believes me. so there's no point in saying it again. Having said that, he stepped onto his sword and landed on a stone pillar in the west without saying anything. Jian Ruoyun raised his eyebrows slightly, but didn't say anything. He rode his sword and landed on a stone pillar in the east. The distance between the two stone pillars was more than 1,000 feet. Jian Ruoyun ranked fourth on Liangwang Peak, and his sword work was profound. It was said that he had made a breakthrough in the upper state of the undefeated after being confined in the stone room for half a year. If he had a few more years, he might have reached the threshold of the free travel state. Who among the disciples of the third generation could be his match, except for Guananshan and Zhuoruzhui, who was still behind closed doors on Tianguang Peak? It was deathly quiet around the stone forest. Nobody thought that Lu Shisui had any chance, even though he had accomplished the tempered will of the sword and formed the chaotic sword on his own. In the next moment the silence was broken. Surprised cries could be heard everywhere in the peaks, especially on the stone platforms where the masters of the 9 peaks stood. It was because Lu Shisui had drawn his sword. It wasn't because his sword was terrifying, on the contrary, it was very quiet. It was strange to use the word quiet to describe a flying sword. Lu Shisui's sword flew forward. It was very slow. It seemed to be carrying a lot of weight. It was as heavy as the sky. The expression on Bai Rujing's face changed slightly. It was he who taught it to Lu Shisui. The problem was that he had taught Lu Shisui for only half a year, but he didn't expect Lu Shisui to have mastered the essence of the inherited heaven sword style. Chapter 99. Countless gazes were fixed on the top of the stone forest. Standing on the stone post, Lu Shisui looked like a wild ghost, his clothes shabby and his hair short like grass. Yet, his sword was so calm and peaceful. He was like the king of the third generation, the pillar general of the state, or a scholar with white hair. Jian Ruoyun hadn't drawn his sword yet. He looked at Lu Shisui's sword in silence. Like him, many people were waiting for Lu Shisui's sword to fly over the stone post in the middle. By then, he would be qualified to ask Jian Ruoyun to draw his sword. Time passed. Lu Shisui's sword flew over the stone post. It happened to be in the middle of the 2 stone posts where he and Jian Ruoyun stood. His sword wills hadn't dispersed after flying over 1,000 feet and were extremely pure. There were no screams because the crowd was shocked speechless. This seemingly meaningless scene revealed a shocking truth in Aoyama. Lu Shisui had already entered the undefeated state. Amazing, said Zhao Lei. Regardless of the hidden reason, Lu Shisui had been imprisoned for the past 2 years, but he had broken through the undefeated state, so he deserved such praise. How old is he? Asked the peak master of Qingrong. A disciple replied uncertainly, 17 or 18? The peak master of Qingrong glanced at Zhao Lei, not far away, saying nothing. The masters of the 9 peaks were all shocked. After the immortal Jingyang, the youngest swordsmen in the undefeated state in Aoyama were Zhao Lei and Zhuoruzhui, and Lu Shisui ranked third. If he had been able to cultivate normally in the past 2 years, would he have advanced faster? If he hadn't done such a thing, and if he hadn't been involved in another murder case, how could Aoyama treat such a genius like him so? Some masters even thought it would be better if what Lu Shisui had said was true. A gust of wind blew from the other side of the cliff. It didn't have the warmth of late spring. The wind landed on Lu Shisui's sword. The sword trembled slightly and suddenly emitted 4 rays of clear light. The 4 beams of clear light were not illusions, but real existences. They were the sword intent. The flying sword sped up all of a sudden, heading toward Jian Ruoyun, who was 1,000 feet away, along with 4 beams of sword energy. Lu Shisui finally made his move, and he used his strongest move. Looking at the bright sword light and the 4 sword energies, Jian Ruoyun waved his sleeve slightly, his expression unchanged. A gray flying sword pierced through the air and instantly appeared in front of Lu Shisui's sword. Being as fast as lightning was just a description. Jian Ryun's sword was like a flash of lightning, too fast to be seen clearly. Lu Shisui's sword, which had been accumulating power for a long time, was blocked before it could reveal its sharpness. The two flying swords met in the air above the stone forest. A sword chime resounded throughout the valley. The two flying swords separated and met again. Then, there were countless reunions. In the blink of an eye, the two swords had collided countless times in the sky. The crisp sword chimes rang out incessantly, like a rainstorm. Innumerable sparks splashed up like a silver tree blooming in front of the peak, illuminating the stone forest. Even the sun in the sky dimmed a little. The two flying swords were fighting in the sky. Lu Shisui and Jian Ruoyun stood on their respective stone pillars, their hands clasped behind their backs, looking at each other calmly from a distance of 3,000 feet. After a long while, the bright gray sword light abruptly vanished. The two flying swords returned to the front of Lu Shisui and Jian Ruoyun respectively. The disciples of Aoyama at the foot of the stone forest were stunned. It was obvious that Big Brother Jian Ruoyun's sword work was much more profound than Lu Shisui's, but why did the two of them end up in a tie? The two flying swords quivered slightly, with hundreds of tiny cracks appearing on their bodies. It seemed that the materials of the two swords were similar. Jian Ruoyun glanced at his own sword. Yet, Lu Shisui took a step forward without even looking at it. Only one person could stand on the stone pillar. His step landed in the air. The flying sword had been waiting there for a long time. The stone platform where the disciples of Liangwang Peak stood was quiet from the beginning to the end. Jian Ruoshan challenged Jingjiu by name, was severely wounded by Lu Shisui with the sword intent, and Lu Shisui challenged Jian Ruoyun by name. Guananshan, Guhan, and Ma Hua remained absolutely silent. Looking at the scene in the sky above the stone forest, Guhan recalled the time when Lu Shisui took a step toward the sky on the sword peak. He felt both gratified and apologetic. The two sword lights illuminated the stone forest again. The fight between Lu Shisui and Jian Ruoyun on their swords was much more dangerous than before. The two sword lights sometimes fell into the clouds, and sometimes flew up into the sky. At the highest point they were almost at the top of Tianguang Peak. The clouds were stirred up like boiling water. Sword marks appeared on the cliff walls, and the stone chips fell off the stone pillars from time to time. The two sword lights moved so fast that ordinary disciples couldn't see them clearly. Only the disciples with higher cultivation states and the masters of the 9 peaks knew how fierce and dangerous this sword fight was. Swoosh! Swoosh! The two sword lights separated again. The two landed on their respective stone pillars. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of Lu Shisui's mouth. There was a tear on Jian Ruoyun's sleeve. Fighting with a sword was never a simple matter of riding the sword. The reason for riding the sword away from the stone pillars was to change the direction of the sword, in case the opponent's flying sword got rid of the entanglement of his own sword and suddenly attacked him. In this way, he could better defend himself. However, since he had to ride on the sword, the attack of the flying sword would be much weaker. Normally, in such a fight, Lu Shisui should have the upper hand. He had already cultivated the sword intent, so he could still attack his opponent in the sky even if he was riding on the sword. However, he didn't expect Jian Ruoyun to be so good at riding the sword that he could avoid his sword intent at the most critical moment and crush him with his sword momentum. Why do so few disciples of our sect cultivate the sword intent? It's because it's an unorthodox method. Standing on the stone pillar, and looking at Lu Shisui a few thousand feet away, Jian Ruoyun said, "It seems that the power of the devil pill can only help you so much." A gust of wind rose up, rolling up the clouds and fog under the stone forest and ruffling his green robe. A powerful energy was emitted from his body. The flying sword sensed it and passed through the clouds, leaving a wisp of white smoke behind. Someone cried out in surprise, the seventh move of the old bird sword style. Borrowing Cloud. Jian Ruyun had been a disciple of Yunxing Peak before he joined Liangwang Peak, and he was the personal disciple of the Peak Master. The main sword of Yunxing Peak was called Absolute Emptiness, and the sword manual was called the Old Bird. There were 13 moves in all. If a disciple in the undefeated state could learn the fifth move, he would be regarded as a talented person. Jian Ruyun had learned the seventh move, Borrowing Cloud. It was said that he had made a breakthrough 2 years ago when he was confined in the stone room on the Shangda Peak for half a year. It seemed that he had mastered the true meaning of the old bird sword style. Looking at the faintly visible flying sword passing through the clouds and fog, his colleagues were full of admiration. The disciples of Yunxing Peak cheered loudly, and the elders nodded in agreement. Seeing the flying sword approaching with the clouds, the expression on Lu Shisui's face changed slightly, and he wielded his sword again. Jing Jiu had said that his eyebrows were too straight, but his sword was actually straighter. The bright flying sword illuminated the stone forest as it flew forward in a straight line. When the two flying swords were about to meet, a loud buzzing sound suddenly burst out in the stone forest. The white clouds and fog rose up with great momentum, flowing in all directions like a vast ocean, immediately engulfing the two swords. Lu Shisui sensed that the connection between him and the flying sword had suddenly weakened. All of a sudden, Jian Ruoyun's sword reappeared, and it arrived in front of Lu Shisui. This gray sword seemed to be able to ignore the distance in the space. A burst of surprised screams burst out in the stone forest. One could peep into the Tao of heaven and earth by means of the changes in the clouds and fog. Jian Ruoyun had proved that he was qualified to enjoy the sceneries of the state of free travel. The gray sword pierced straight into Lu Shisui's face, seemingly without any intention of stopping. Everybody thought that Jian Ruoyun would withdraw his sword in the end, so they weren't worried. Lu Shisui was the only one who could sense Jian Ruoyun's lethal intent. Chapter 100. Many people thought they heard the howl of a wounded wild beast, but they didn't know where the sound came from. It was quiet in the forest between the peaks and the cliff behind the clouds. The sound seemed to be ringing in their minds. Jian Ruoyun heard the howl as well. He knew where the sound came from, even though Lu Shisui didn't open his mouth. He could see the anger on Lu Shisui's face and the determination in his eyes from a distance of 1,000 feet. That resolute expression quickly transformed into a faint flame that was incomparably bright red and extremely strange. Lu Shisui's body exuded a powerful and wild energy. At this moment, he seemed to have turned into a primeval demon. The air around Lu Shisui began to circulate at a high speed. It was extremely hot around him, as if countless invisible flames were spurting out. Along with a sizzling sound, the clouds and fog that came with the flying sword were burned to ashes before they could even touch his body. Jian Ruoyun's flying sword sensed the danger and was about to fly away, but it was trapped by an invisible force, vibrating and making shrill whistling sounds. It struggled with all its might, but it couldn't leave. It hovered in the air in front of the stone pillar, like a moth trapped in a spider's web. "The demonic fire!" someone shouted in surprise. The teachers of the Shanghai Peak, who were in charge of maintaining the order of the sword trial, grew solemn. They were ready to ride their swords and open the formation around the stone forest at any moment. Boom! The stone pillar under Lu Shisui's feet couldn't stand the high temperature and the sword wheels anymore, sputtering countless rocks and dust. The rocks and dust rolled forward, dispersing the clouds and fog that came with Jian Ruoyun's flying sword, as if countless mountain peaks had fallen into the sea. Jian Ruoyun swallowed the blood that was gushing up his throat and used all his sword source to forcefully call back the flying sword trapped by the invisible flame. As the sword light flickered, he had already landed on the sword. The sword broke through the wind and arrived in front of Lu Shisui. He was ready to ride his sword to kill him again. At this critical moment, he met Lu Shisui's eyes through the invisible flame. He saw Lu Shisui's eyes clearly. That pair of eyes that were once clear and without impurities were now only bright. That was because there was a true wildfire in the depths of those eyes. The wild and untamable flame seemed faint, but it gave people a feeling that it would never change. It was extremely strange. Jian Ruyun had seen such a pair of eyes before. 2 years ago, on that night in the muddy river, he and Lu Shisui took the risk to dive to the bottom of the river to hunt down the seriously injured Dace Devil. The Dace Devil glanced at him before it died. He remembered very clearly that it was this pair of eyes, this kind of wildfire. Jian Ruyun was slightly startled, a hint of remorse showing in his eyes. He yelled loudly and was about to ride his sword to flee. It was too late. Just like that night. Suddenly, he stopped moving. His eyes became a little confused, as if he didn't know why he was here. The flying sword let out a clear ring, and he woke up again. Everything happened in an instant. In a battle between flying swords, it was all about a split second. A bright sword light pierced through his chest. Blood splattered everywhere. Jian Ruyun fell down from the sword toward the ground. The expression on Lu Shisui's face was indifferent, and he didn't intend to spare his opponent's life. The bright sword light suddenly turned around and slashed toward Jian Ruyun's neck. Jian Ruyun didn't have the strength to fight back. His head and body were about to be cut in half. Screams broke out around the stone forest. It was then that a bright sword light broke through the protective formation of the stone forest like a rainbow and arrived in front of Jian Ruyun. Crack! Several clear sounds rang out. The bright sword light wrapped up Lu Shisui's sword and pulled it to a high altitude far away from the stone forest, and then it was shredded into pieces. That sword rider had a powerful cultivation in sword work. The disciples of Aoyama thought it must be a senior master in the state of free travel who had helped Jian Ruyun, so they felt relieved. Lu Shisui spat out a mouthful of blood after his flying sword was destroyed. Unexpectedly, he didn't want to let it go. He jumped down from the shaking stone post and chased after Jian Ruyun like a rock, as if he had gone mad. A figure left the cliff and leaped into the air. He arrived in front of Lu Shisui and hit his chest with his palm. Pa! Pa! Countless sounds rang out. In a very short time, Lu Shisui's body had suffered dozens of heavy blows. That person's strike was very clean and simple, but Lu Shisui had no way to dodge it. He kept spitting out blood, creating a bloody rain in the sky. In the end, he fell to the ground miserably with a loud thud. That person landed by his side. He waved his sleeves lightly, creating a few air currents, and slowly caught Jian Ruyun. The disciples of Shiryu Peak hurried over and started treating Jian Ruyun. The clouds and fog had dispersed, and the smoke and dust had settled down. The bright sword light turned around in the sky and hovered quietly in front of that person. This flying sword was blue, like the ocean. Illuminated by the sword light, that person's clothing seemed to be blue as well. The expression on that person's face was as nonchalant as usual, but a hint of pity could be seen in his eyes. It wasn't until now that the disciples saw clearly that it wasn't one of the senior masters who struck Jian Ruyun, but Guananshan. Guananshan was the principal disciple of the sect master and the principal disciple of Liangwang Peak, loved and respected by his colleagues, but his cultivation state wasn't that impressive, at least not as famous as Zhuoruzhui. Unexpectedly, he was already a swordsman in the free travel state. Zhao Lei had been watching Jingjiu with the corner of her eye. The expression on Jingjiu's face hadn't changed, as if he wasn't interested in what was happening in the stone forest. She knew it wasn't true. It was because she was certain that when Guananshan struck in person and beat Lu Shisui until he vomited blood and fell to the ground, Jingjiu had made a move. The regular people couldn't even tell that Jingjiu had made a move. If Zhao Lei hadn't been observing him carefully, she wouldn't have noticed it either. At that moment, the expression on Jingjiu's face didn't change, as he moved the index finger of his right hand slightly. You have indeed eaten the Dace Devil's devil pill. Looking at Lu Shui, Guananshan said regretfully and disappointedly, and you have even learned the deviant methods of the Bloody Demon Church. Countless angry gazes fell on Lu Shui as he said this. Though there was no evidence that Lu Shui had eaten the devil pill, it had been tacitly accepted by the people of Aoyama. But the Bloody Demon Church? Many years ago, there was a deviant sect called the Bloody Demon Church in Chaotian. The magic methods they practiced were very evil, causing harm to countless people. After being attacked by the Orthodox sects, the Bloody Demon Church even colluded with the underworld secretly, committing all kinds of evil deed. Later, the Bloody Demon Church was finally wiped out by the Swordsmen of Aoyama sect, Zhongzhou School, No Mercy sect, Ozawa and the royal family. At that time, the Windy Broadsword Church and the Western Sea Sword School hadn't appeared yet. It was rumored in the cultivation circle that the Bloody Demon Church had left many secret deviant method. Unexpectedly, the rumor was true. However, Lu Shui had stayed on the 9 peaks of Aoyama the entire time. Where did he get this deviant method? Chapter 101. Lu Shui sat on the ground with his back against the stone post, his body covered in blood. Though he was stared at by countless angry gazes, he didn't care at all. So what? As long as I can kill him, I'm willing to do anything. Guananshan looked at Jianryun, who was being resuscitated, and said, You wouldn't have been able to hurt him today if he hadn't suspected you of learning the deviant method. Of course he wouldn't suspect me, because he knows I'm not that kind of person. Lu Shui turned his head with difficulty and looked at the unconscious Jianryun, saying, He was the one who wanted to eat the devil pill back then. Guananshan shook his head, saying, It's already come to this. Why do you still want to ruin his reputation? Lu Shui said, 2 years ago, I discovered that he wanted to steal the devil pill at the bottom of the muddy river. I tried to stop him, but he sneak attacked me. This is the truth. Why would I ruin his reputation? Guananshan looked at Qiyan. Over the last 2 years, the Shanghai Peak had been in charge of the interrogation of Lu Shui. The other disciples of Aoyama had no idea what had happened. Qiyan said expressionlessly, You don't need to know the truth. We won't believe you. Lu Shui continued nonchalantly, 2 years ago you tortured me. I didn't say a word no matter how painful it was, because I knew you wouldn't believe me. Last year, you came to interrogate me again. I finally started to talk, but you still didn't believe me. Now that you've decided that I'm the bad one, why do you still ask me? Qiyan said calmly, Because what happened today has proved that you did eat the devil pill. Only Lu Shui and Jianryun knew what had happened at the bottom of the muddy river. There were no other witnesses, and the devil pill was the only evidence. In the last 2 years, nobody in Shanghai Peak, including Qiyan, could find any direct evidence proving that Lu Shui had eaten the devil pill because of the secret magic imprinted in his soul. Today, the evidence finally appeared. Lu Shui suddenly laughed out loud, his mood somewhat deranged. I went to snatch that Yao core, and the Yao core entered my body by itself. It entered by itself. What could I do? He glanced at Guananshan and then at Qiyan and his fellow disciples who were looking at him with disgust. He spread out his hands and asked, If it were you, what would you do? When he asked this question, he was still laughing loudly, but at some point, his face was already covered in tears. The dust and blood stains were washed away, making him look like a complete mess. There was silence. If what he said was true, what would I do if I were in his shoes? The Aoyama disciples were asking themselves this question in their hearts. If they couldn't find an answer, it meant that they already had an answer. Looking at Lu Shui, whose face was covered in tears, many people sympathized with him, but they still refused to believe his words. Venomous slander! Senior brother Jian has already been harmed like this by you, and you still want to ruin his reputation. You are a shameless scoundrel. You took advantage of the fact that my big brother is unconscious and unable to speak to you to frame him in such a despicable way. The disciples of Liangwang Peak and Yunxing Peak couldn't stand it anymore, cursing loudly. By now, the treatment of Jian Ruyun on Shiyue Peak had finished. It was confirmed that Jian Ruyun's injury was severe, but his life was not in danger. Hearing this, Guanan Shan and many others felt relieved. Lu Shisui felt relieved as well. He had finally vented the anger that had been holding him up until today. He had prepared for 2 years in silence, and he didn't hesitate to expose that he had eaten the Yao core in secret just to kill Jian Ruyun. However, he didn't succeed in the end. Leaning against the stone post, he didn't speak anymore, his face full of despair. Qi Yan announced Lu Shisui's crimes in public. In addition to eating the Yao core and practicing the deviant magic method, he also had another crime related to the death of Zhou Yi of Bihu Peak. Some hot-tempered disciples of Bihu Peak spat and cursed in Lu Shisui's direction. In the end, they announced the end of Lu Shisui. He was sentenced to death by the sword. Jingjiu looked at the young man under the stone post in silence. Lu Shisui had grown up a lot compared to when they were in the small village a few years ago. Jingjiu hadn't seen him for 3 years, so he felt his face was a bit strange. Zhao Lei shot him a glance and said, "I object." The disciples were all startled. According to the sword justice of Aoyama, it was a capital punishment to sentence a disciple to death by the sword. Even the sect master or Shanghai Peak couldn't make the decision on their own, it had to be approved by all the peak masters. If one peak master disagreed, the punishment couldn't be carried out, and the disciple had to be locked up in the sword jail, even if he would never come out again. Among the prisoners locked up in the sword jail at the bottom of Shangda Peak, some were disciples of the Aoyama sect, except for those demons and deviant followers who couldn't be killed. Qi Yan furrowed his brows slightly, asking, "May I ask why?" The authority of Shangda Peak had been challenged, but he had to respect Zhao Lei's status as the master of Shinma Peak. Jian Ruoyun didn't die. No disciple of Aoyama died because of him from the beginning to the end, so why did he have to die? Zhao Lei went on, "And didn't you hear what he said just now? Now that there is a secret, why don't we wait for Jian Ruoyun to wake up and ask him?" What she said showed that she was suspicious of Jian Ruoyun and sided with Lu Shisui. Upon hearing this, the disciples of Liangwang Peak and Yunxing Peak couldn't help but glare at each other angrily. "What are you looking at?" asked Zhao Lei while looking at them with a calm expression. The disciples of the 2 peaks came back to their senses, realizing that their behavior was extremely rude, so they withdrew their gazes resentfully. What else is there to ask? Everyone has eyes. The devil pill is in Lu Shisui's stomach. Looking at Jian Ruoyun, who was still unconscious, the peak master of Yunxing shouted angrily. He was already furious. Zhao Lei remained calm, saying, "So what? I still don't agree." She meant she didn't agree. As long as she didn't agree, Lu Shisui wouldn't die. It was quiet around the stone forest. Everybody knew that Lu Shisui would survive. The problem was being imprisoned in the sword jail and never to see the light of day for the rest of his life better than death? Jingjiu still didn't say anything, because he knew this wasn't the real ending. As expected, the distant voice of the sect master came from the peak top. This is the first time in 100 years that the 9th peak has participated in a meeting in Aoyama. Please think it over, Shanghai Peak. The 3-foot sword suddenly started vibrating, emitting a strand of extremely cold energy. Yuan Qijing's voice spread throughout the peaks, falling into the ears of the disciples like icicles, making them feel very uncomfortable. Seize his sword pill, break his meridians, purge his elixir poison, destroy his cultivation, and expel him from Aoyama. Tianguang Peak will deal with it on their own. This was Lu Shisui's final ending. Everyone knew that Shanghai Peak was willing to take a step back because the sect master had spoken. The sect master's words were to give face to enlightened Jingyang's direct disciples. Then why did Zhao Liu step forward to protect Lu Shisui's life? Many people had already guessed that it had something to do with Jingjiu. Many people still remembered the relationship between him and Lu Shisui. A Shanghai Peak deacon helped Lu Shisui up, using a sword rope to tie his arms. Lu Shisui looked at Jingjiu, who was on the cliff platform. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said loudly, "I don't need your fake mercy." Jingjiu's expression was indifferent, and he still didn't say anything. "When I needed help the most, where were you? When I was at my worst, where were you? You left. You left Aoyama to travel. I know you purposely avoided them, but why? Was it because you were afraid of offending them? Or were you afraid of seeing me in such a miserable state?" Lu Shisui said sadly, "Yes, you are the most promising swordsman in Aoyama sect, and I am just an abandoned disciple. Moreover, there is no friendship between us. You only lived in my house for a year. Back at the South Pine Pavilion, at the stream of sword washing, they used me to mock you. You must have been annoyed by me back then, right?" Silence reigned. Lu Shisui gradually calmed down. Looking at Jingjiu on the cliff, he said seriously, "But I really didn't think of you like that, obviously." He didn't finish his words, but he stopped here. Because Jingjiu raised his hand. Just like in the small village, at the South Pine Pavilion, at the stream of sword washing. With a gesture and a look, Lu Shisui could understand what he meant. Jingjiu felt that he talked too much and was very noisy. Lu Shisui smiled bitterly and said no more. Lu Shisui was taken away by the deacons of Shangda Peak. Later, the masters of Tianguang Peak would execute those cruel punishments, and then he would be expelled from Aoyama. Jingjiu watched in silence as Lu Shisui disappeared on the mountain path. He still didn't say anything. Countless gazes fell on him. Both the masters and the disciples were thinking that this man was really ruthless. Zhao Liu suddenly asked, was he telling the truth? Jingjiu was silent for a while and then said, "The dream is still before the body, and the dream is still in the dream." "I'm not sure." Zhao Liu asked, "Why didn't you explain to him?" Jingjiu said, "You know, I was just a guest staying in his house for a year, and I paid enough money. Despite such a big event, the sword trial had to go on, just like life. Jian Ruishan was severely wounded by Lu Shisui, so he couldn't fight again. His opponent was lucky enough to win without a fight and enter the second round. As the next disciple on the list was about to enter the arena, Jingjiu suddenly stood up. There was a slight commotion in the crowd. Many people thought he was too ashamed to stay here and was about to leave. Zhao Liu knew it wasn't the case. She thought with a smile, didn't he say that he was just a passerby? Jingjiu walked down the stone platform from the path between the cliffs and came to the arena. He lifted his head to take a look at the sword forest, and found those stone pillars were indeed very high. The middle part of the pillars was shrouded by clouds and fog, so he couldn't see the top of the pillars clearly. The disciples didn't know what he was going to do and why he was standing there looking up at the sky. The disciple who was about to enter the arena didn't know what he should do either. Should he go up and ask him to get out of the way? Qi Yan asked with raised eyebrows, "Young Brother Jing, why are you standing here?" Jingjiu pulled back his gaze and said, "I've made an appointment with the Zhongzhou school to play chess with Tong Yen at the plum meeting next year." Everybody knew about such a famous event. Many disciples thought he was asking to be humiliated, and even humiliated his own sect. Besides, he was going to the plum meeting next year, so what did it have to do with him standing here? "I just remembered that I have to be qualified to go to the plum meeting, and I have to participate in the sword trial of Aoyama." Chapter 102. Qi Yan was taken aback. He didn't expect Jingjiu to say he wanted to participate in the sword trial after mentioning the plum meeting. The others didn't expect it either. The stone forest was shrouded in an eerie silence. Qi Yan came back to his senses and thought it was ridiculous. "You're not a disciple of the third generation anymore, so you can't participate in the sword trial," he said. "Then how can I participate in the plum meeting?" Jingjiu asked. Qi Yan thought Jingjiu was already a master of the second generation. If he really wanted to go to the plum meeting and be humiliated by Tong Yan, he would have a way, like being the leader of the group. Jingjiu said, "Many people won't be convinced if I can get the qualification to go to the plum meeting without participating in the sword trial." The crowd thought, "So you know it." Of course, no one was convinced by Jingjiu, especially those disciples who had a high cultivation state and wanted to show their skills at the sword trial. They admitted that Jingjiu had a high talent in sword work, but he was too young and had a low cultivation state. If he hadn't been lucky enough to climb the top of Shima Peak with Zhao Liu, he wouldn't have become their senior master. "So I still have to participate." Jingjiu looked in the direction of the disciples of Liangwang Peak and said, "As long as I win, nobody will be convinced." Hearing this, the disciples of Aoyama were in an uproar, thinking this person was so arrogant. Qi Yan thought for a while and said, "The drawing of lots is over. It's too late to arrange it now." Jingjiu said, "Just name someone." Jian Rushan could name someone to challenge him, so he could name someone else to challenge. Many gazes followed Jingjiu's gaze to the second stone platform in the cliff. "Please advise me," Jingjiu said while looking at a disciple of Liangwang Peak. That person was a little chubby and looked harmless to humans and animals. The fat disciple was called Ma Hua, an inconspicuous name. He was ranked 37th on Liangwang Peak, which was also inconspicuous. The disciples of Liangwang Peak were very famous, but many people didn't know him, which showed how low-key he was, or how easily he was neglected. The disciples couldn't understand why Jingjiu wanted to challenge this person by name. As for the outcome, Jingjiu was still in the state of inherited will. Theoretically, any disciple of Liangwang Peak could easily defeat him. However, not long ago, Jian Ruoshan, ranked 46th on Liangwang Peak, was easily defeated by Lu Shisui. Who knew if Jingjiu would surprise them again? The sword light moved slightly and Ma Hua came to the scene. He looked at Jingjiu with a smile and said in a voice that only the two of them could hear, "How did you know that I was the one who reported Lu Shisui?" Jingjiu said, "I don't know." Ma Hua's expression changed slightly. "Then why do you want to challenge me?" He thought he had guessed the truth. Jingjiu wanted to avenge Lu Shisui. Jingjiu did not know that Shanghai Peak suspected that Lu Shisui was involved in the death of Zuo Yi of Bihu Peak because Ma Hua found that Lu Shisui was not there that night. He also did not know that Ma Hua and Gu Han already knew that he was not there that night. In order to cover up for him, Lu Shisui insisted on not saying where he was. He only knew that this inconspicuous fat man was the military counselor of Liangwang Peak, and the trap set by Lu Shisui should be this person's plan. Most importantly, he had not liked this fat man since the stream of sword washing. Ma Hua stopped smiling and looked at him seriously. For years had passed, and he found that he still could not see through this young man. That was why he had been vigilant and even hostile toward him. "I know you must be hiding your strength. For example, no one has ever seen you ride a sword. But I am sure that you have been able to," he said to Jingjiu. "So, no matter who wins today, I can see some of your secrets. It is not bad." After saying this, he rode his sword, broke through the clouds, and landed on a stone pillar high up. Judging from the sword light, Ma Hua should be in the initial state of the undefeated, which was a bit ordinary by the standard of Liangwang Peak. Countless eyes fell on Jingjiu, full of curiosity. Many sword-washing disciples could ride a sword, not to mention the disciples participating in the sword trial today. Normally, Jingjiu should have been able to ride a sword, but no one had ever seen him do it. Some even thought that he had encountered some strange obstacles in his sword cultivation. People were curious to know how he was going to climb up the stone pillar that was more than 1,000 feet high. If he could not even climb up the stone pillar, how could he talk about the sword trial? Qi Yan raised his right hand, inviting him to go ahead. Jingjiu untied the iron sword from his back and held it up in the air. This posture looked a bit weird, like a hunter walking into a dark forest with a torch in his hand. Seeing this, the disciples were slightly surprised, wondering what he was going to do. Qi Yan thought of a possibility and raised his eyebrows slightly. Some gray-haired elders on the stone platform also felt they had seen it somewhere before. They wondered with uncertainty if this was the burning sky move of the 9 Deaths sword formula. In ancient times, there were many ways for swordsmen to ride a sword. Later, there were fewer and fewer ways. Now, people only rode on swords. There was a reason for this. Riding on swords allowed one to come and go freely and easily. More importantly, when a practitioner stood on a sword, he could use his empty hands to perform the sword formula, which made it easier for him to attack. If one used other ways to ride a sword, he would need to hold the sword hilt with his hands, which would naturally be less flexible. A buzzing sound suddenly came from the bottom of the stone forest. Air billowed and gravel rolled. Jingjiu disappeared from where he was. No one realized what had happened. People looked up subconsciously and saw a hole in the clouds in the sky. They could vaguely see a black dot. Did he flee out of fear or something? Countless gazes fell on the sky. It was quiet. With a whistling sound of the sword, Jingjiu reappeared in people's sight, landing on a stone pillar. No matter what others thought of him, he was very calm. Zhao Lei felt a bit embarrassed and lowered her head to drink her tea. She guessed that it was because he hadn't flown on a sword for a long time that he was a bit rusty and couldn't control it, so he flew a bit too high. It was indeed very high. The masters of the Aoyama saw clearly that Jingjiu flew to the top of the Aoyama formation before he landed. They couldn't help but be amazed. He was still in the inherited will, but he could fly to such a height on a sword in such a short time. This young disciple was indeed a genius swordsman worthy of the expectations of the Aoyama. On a stone pillar dozens of feet away, Ma Hua's fat face showed a serious expression for the first time. He said, "I didn't expect your swordsmanship to be so good. I guess you are preparing to amaze the world at some point in the future. I feel sorry for you that you were forced to use it today." Jingjiu didn't say anything. He never rode on a sword in the past. It had nothing to do with hiding his strength and hoping to amaze the world at one point. He had his own reasons. Ma Hua smiled and suddenly jumped on his sword again, landing on a stone pillar further away. Now the distance between the 2 stone pillars was more than 300 feet. The flying sword of the disciples of the inherited will state couldn't kill more than 300 feet. Even if Jingjiu was talented and his swordsmanship was far superior to the ordinary disciples of the inherited will state, his flying sword would be like an arrow at the end of its flight in front of Ma Hua. Seeing this, the disciples of the Shanghai Peak and the other peaks frowned. Only the disciples of Liangwang Peak didn't change their expressions. They were familiar with Ma Hua's style of doing things. They knew he wouldn't miss any details and wouldn't care about other people's evaluation. He just wanted to win. Chapter 103. Before Jingjiu could react, Ma Hua made his move first. The sword whistled through the dense stone forest. A streak of sword light attacked Jingjiu. At such a distance, Jingjiu could not counterattack with his flying sword, so he could only choose to dodge. The only way he could defeat Ma Hua was to fly up on his sword and take the risk to shorten the distance between him and Ma Hua. That was what the disciple of Bihu Peak did when he fought against his senior brother of Tianguang Peak, whose realm was much higher than his. Ma Hua was good at scheming, so he had calculated everything clearly. He was ready to withdraw his flying sword and move backward again if Jingjiu could really avoid his flying sword and get close to him. Anyway, he had to keep a distance from Jingjiu so that he could be invincible. As for the shame of doing so, he did not consider it at all. Of course, it would be better if such a scene did not happen. Therefore, he was very serious when he attacked. He wanted to defeat Jingjiu with only one move. On the stone platform, Yunqing Peak Master suddenly waved his sleeve. An extremely powerful aura surged around the peak. The clouds in the stone forest were affected by this aura and slowly sank down until they fell to the ground, forming a layer of clouds about 2 feet thick. It was a beautiful scene, but everyone knew that Yunqing Peak Master did not want to create a scene, but to let the disciples on the ground see clearly what would happen next. The masters, including Yunqing Peak Master, were very curious about how Jingjiu would break the situation created by Ma Hua, and they wanted to let the disciples learn something from it. From this point of view, it was evident that they favored Jingjiu more in this fight. Go. Jingjiu used the method he was most familiar with to break Ma Hua's situation, and he only said one word. The iron sword pierced through the air and flew to the stone pillar more than 300 feet away. It was not accurate to use the word fly, because the iron sword was so fast that there was no residual shadow, and the sword light did not even have time to turn into a line. The spectators only saw a blur before their eyes. Just like when Jingjiu had left the ground, the iron sword had already arrived between the 2 stone pillars. At this time, Ma Hua's flying sword was less than 20 feet away from the stone pillar. Looking at the iron sword, Ma Hua was shocked and frightened. He quickly used his sword essence to forcefully summon his flying sword in front of him. A crisp sound rang out. The wind howled above the stone forest, and the sound waves spread in all directions. At the critical moment, his sword blocked Jingjiu's iron sword by a hair's breadth. He fell onto the stone pillar and was at a loss of what to do. His sea of consciousness trembled and rippled, and his sword pellet couldn't calm down. Jingjiu's sword was so powerful. This was not only referring to the immense power contained in the sword, but also its speed. With a swoosh, Jingjiu's iron sword turned back again. Still, there was no residual shadow, only a very short sword light. Ma Hua knew that he would not be able to block this sword. With a muffled groan, he stepped on the sword and fled further away without hesitation. A moment later, he landed on another stone post 100 feet away. Turning his head around, he found that the stone post he had been standing on had been cut by Jingjiu's iron sword. Countless stone chips were falling down to the ground, looking like the heavy snowflakes dancing in the air. Ma Hua's face was pale, and his sword robe was soaked in cold sweat. Strategies and contingency plans were meaningless in the face of absolute speed and power. When the iron sword flew toward him, he even felt the aura of death. He did not dare to imagine what would have happened if he had reacted a little bit slower. In fact, he did not have time to think about this, because Jingjiu's sword was coming again. The iron sword whistled through the air with great momentum. Ma Hua knew that he could not block this sword, and he could not avoid it either. He held the sword in front of him and shouted, "I admit." A loud bang resounded. Jingjiu did not give him a chance to admit defeat. The iron sword swung down and cut off the word that Ma Hua was about to utter. Ma Hua spat out a mouthful of blood. He could not withstand it any longer, and fell down from the stone pillar. The surprised screams could be heard everywhere on the peak. Jingjiu didn't stop there. The iron sword chased after Ma Hua and continued to slash down. Strangely enough, Ma Hua managed to maintain the posture of holding the sword while falling down to the ground, but he managed to block most of the attacks. The iron sword kept hacking on his sword, like a heavy hammer pounding on it, making loud noises. "Pa! Pa!" The terrifying noises echoed on Tianguang Peak. Ma Hua landed heavily on the ground with a loud boom, scattering the ocean of clouds. The iron sword flew back. The disciples of Shiyue Peak hurried over. Ma Hua was helped to his feet. His face was pale, his body covered in blood, and he was in an extremely sorry state. The physical strength of the cultivation practitioners was much stronger than that of mortals. He was not truly hit by Jingjiu's sword. Though his sword pill was damaged and he was severely wounded, his life was not in danger. Looking at the figure on top of the stone pillar, a hint of fear showed in his eyes. "When did you break through the state?" he asked in a trembling voice. During the sword fight above the stone forest, Jingjiu's flying sword could still exert such a powerful force from a distance of more than 300 feet. It could be said that Jingjiu was gifted in this aspect. However, these stone pillars were more than 1,000 feet high, so the distance between Jingjiu and Ma Hua was probably close to 2,000 feet. His sword could still follow Ma Hua and hack him from the sky to the ground before he could fly back. What did it prove? Only the disciples of the undefeated state could do it. Many people, like Ma Hua, had the same thought. Countless gazes were fixed on the figure above the stone forest. Just now, Jingjiu's voice came from above the stone forest. There was an uproar. Yet what Jingjiu said was the truth. He had been preparing to break through the state of the undefeated while traveling with Zhao Liu, and he had sensed it last autumn. For some reason, to be exact, because of his physical condition, he had been hesitating. Until just now, when he saw Lu Shisui being beaten to the ground by Guananshan, he finally made up his mind. Ma Hua naturally didn't believe him. He squeezed out a bitter smile on his blood-stained face and said, "Is it necessary to fight with a fellow disciple?" As soon as he finished speaking, he spat out another mouthful of blood, with a few broken teeth in it, which were shaken off by Jingjiu's sword. Some people thought the scene of Ma Hua being smashed from the stone pillar to the ground by the iron sword was somewhat familiar. Then they remembered that not long ago, the scene of Lu Shisui being disabled by Guananshan was exactly the same. This guy is still so vengeful. Lin Wuji thought of the inherited sword competition 3 years ago, when Jingjiu knocked Gu Qing 3 times, and shook his head with a bitter smile. In front of him, Elder Bai Rujing frowned slightly, and no one knew what he was thinking. Elder Imo chuckled, seeming to appreciate Ma Hua's performance. In this sword fight, no one came to Ma Hua's rescue, and no one called for a stop, because everyone could see that Jingjiu didn't use his full strength. Otherwise, how could the iron sword hit Ma Hua's sword so accurately every time? Of course, this was not because Jingjiu was being merciful. On the contrary, he wanted to beat Ma Hua to the ground in front of the disciples of Aoyama, and humiliate Liangwang Peak. There was nothing wrong with Ma Hua's response, and his deduction of the battle situation was quite accurate. However, it was meaningless in front of Jingjiu's sword. The only problem was that Jingjiu had come to Aoyama for only 6 years. How could he have such an abundant sword source? Qi Yan looked up at the top of the stone forest and asked, "Shall we continue?" Jingjiu knew that this elder of Shangda Peak should have guessed his intention, so he looked at the stone platform where the disciples of Liangwang Peak were. "Please advise me." This time, he was looking at Gu Han. Chapter 104. There was an uproar. The disciples of Aoyama had figured out Jingjiu's intention. Did he want to challenge the entire Liangwang Peak? Because he wanted to avenge Lu Shisui? Of course, it was not for this reason, because Jingjiu and Liangwang Peak had been enemies for a long time. The disciples of Aoyama spent most of their time in closed-door cultivation, but many of them knew what had happened by the stream of sword washing. It was rare for a disciple of Liangwang Peak to be rendered speechless by an ordinary disciple of sword washing. Would Gu Han accept his challenge? There could be no other answer to this question. The sword light flickered. Gu Han landed on the stone pillar, looked at Jingjiu, and said, "I have always disliked you, but my opinion of you has changed today." He meant that Jingjiu was willing to stand up for Lu Shisui and challenge Liang Wang Peak. Jingjiu understood what he meant and said, "My opinion of you has not changed. Many years ago, when Liang Wang Peak started to have a special status in Aoyama, he began to dislike it. Many years later, he still disliked Liang Wang Peak, such as the Fat Man and Guananshan. But he disliked Gu Han the most. This had something to do with his current disciple Guqing, but it was mostly because of Lu Shisui. Maybe it was because Lu Shisui had mentioned Gu Han too many times in the Manor Cave by the stream 4 years ago. He called Gu Han Big Brother too naturally and praised Gu Han as a good man. "Even if you break through the state of the undefeated, you are still no match for me." Gu Han looked at him and said emotionlessly, "I know I have a bad temper, but there is nothing wrong with my swordsmanship." Jingjiu said, "I once told you that in my opinion, your swordsmanship is all wrong. If the entire swordsmanship was wrong, then there must be something wrong with the swordsmanship." Gu Han remembered clearly that Jingjiu said the same thing to Guananshan 3 years ago at Shilai Peak. "Prove it to us." Gu Han waved his sleeve. A white sword light broke through the sky. The clouds in the sky suddenly twisted. Wherever the sword light passed, there was a faint sound of thunder. It carried with it countless fine threads of light, as if it was a lightning bolt that had shrunk countless times. He used Bihu Peak's 8 directions sword style. What was surprising was that Jingjiu's sword was really fast. Even though it was launched later, it arrived first. In the middle of the 2 stone pillars, the 2 flying swords collided, causing a loud noise. Accompanied by a wave of air, the iron sword flew back diagonally. No matter how abundant Jingjiu's sword energy was, he still couldn't rely on pure speed to make up for the gap in cultivation level. Gu Han looked at him in silence. The white sword light continued forward. Jingjiu's expression did not change. He reached for the hilt of his sword and turned to leave. With a buzz, his figure disappeared from the stone pillar. In the next moment, he appeared on another stone pillar several hundred feet away. But at the same time, Gu Han's sword arrived. Jingjiu seemed to be able to see what was happening behind him. He rode on his sword and dodged the sword, arriving at the cliff north of the stone forest. The iron sword flew in front of the cliff. Without the cover of the clouds, it could be seen very clearly. It attracted many exclamations from the ground. No one expected that Jingjiu's sword was so fast, and his riding speed was so amazing. Gu Han's flying sword was like a maggot attached to the bone. It was getting closer and closer, but it couldn't catch up. How could riding a sword be as fast as a flying sword? What kind of speed was that? The situation now was completely different from the previous battle. Jingjiu seemed to be in a completely passive position like Ma Hua. Now that Gu Han had the absolute advantage, he wouldn't miss it. With a cold look in his eyes, he made a sword gesture with his right hand. The white sword light suddenly lengthened and slashed towards the cliff. The iron sword suddenly turned around and dodged with Jingjiu. The white sword light rushed forward again. The iron sword dodged again. Several deep sword marks appeared on the cliff, and gravel fell down. Jingjiu rode his sword further away, and the white sword light chased after him. In a few seconds, they had arrived at the extreme west of the stone forest. The stone pillars here were much more sparse than in front of the peak, and there was a distance of more than 100 feet between each stone pillar. The sword light disappeared, and Jingjiu stopped on a stone pillar. At this time, he was already a few miles away from the stone platform in front of the peak. In the eyes of the crowd, he became a small black dot. Gu Han was a swordsman in the upper state of the undefeated, but he couldn't attack from such a distance. He sneered, stepped on the flying sword that had been called back, and flew to where Jingjiu was. After a while, countless sword lights lit up in the west of the stone forest. Stone chips flew everywhere, and smoke and dust rose, blocking the sight of many disciples with lower states. The disciples knew that the battle was very fierce, but they couldn't see the specific situation, so they couldn't help but feel anxious. Some bold disciples disregarded the rules and rode their swords to the top of the stone forest. On the stone platform, many teachers also stood up and looked in that direction. The endless sword art is as dense as snow. I think it is more suitable to block the way than the 7-apricot sword art. Gu-han is so familiar with it. It seems that he has worked hard for a few years. Look, senior brother Gu is still using the 8-side sword art? I'm afraid that even the senior brothers on Bihu Peak are not as familiar as him. Senior brother Gu really has the most profound attainment in the 6 dragons sword art. No wonder Gu Qing also learned this. The real sword of the 3 peaks is at his fingertips. Senior brother Gu is indeed the top 3 swordsmen in Liangwang Peak. He is really admirable. Don't forget that senior brother Gu was born in Tianguang Peak, and he hasn't used the inherited Heaven's sword art yet. What about the supreme sword of Liangwang Peak? That is the real level of senior brother Gu. As long as he uses it, Jingjiu will definitely lose. Amidst the praises, there were naturally many people who thought of another fact. Gu Han's cultivation in swordsmanship was extremely high, and his swordsmanship was even more exquisite. However, Jingjiu's iron sword was still there. No matter how hard his sword was suppressed, after a period of time, his sword light would always reappear in front of everyone. This was truly a shocking matter. If he had just entered the state of the undefeated, how could he have held on for so long in front of a swordsman like Gu Han? All the peak leaders and elders were able to clearly see the scene of the battle that was happening a few miles away. They were sure that Jingjiu was using the 9 Deaths sword art of Shenma Peak. It was rumored that before martial uncle Jingyang ascended, he hid the sword manual of the 9 Deaths sword art and the thoughtless sword on the top of Shenma Peak, and Zhao Lei found them that night. Now it seemed that the rumor was true. What surprised them was that Jingjiu's swordsmanship was extremely skillful. It didn't look like he had only practiced for 3 years, but more like he had practiced for 300 years. Moreover, when he used the 9 Deaths sword art, it was obviously different from the rumored 9 Deaths sword art. Some elders thought that youngest martial uncle's swordsmanship was so cold and aloof, and it was not as plain as Gu Han's. Yes, the 9 Deaths sword art in Jingjiu's hands was very plain. It didn't look like he was going to die. It was more like he had seen through life and death. No matter how strong Gu Han's sword light was, the iron sword was still calm. It didn't look like it was at an absolute disadvantage. The sword light only lasted for a dozen breaths. It was still very short. But in Gu Han's eyes, it was very embarrassing that he still couldn't defeat Jingjiu after such a long time. He couldn't accept it. He decided to end this fight as soon as possible. A clear howl burst out from his lips. His flying sword ignored Jingjiu's iron sword and suddenly accelerated. It turned into a dazzling white light and attacked Jingjiu's face. The iron sword was no longer blocked. It cut through the wind and almost cut his body at the same time. Gu Han's expression didn't change. He crossed his hands in front of him, and a strong aura appeared. Seeing this, Qi Yan raised his eyebrows and guessed what he was going to do. An elder cried out in shock, "Cold well locking clear autumn." Chapter 105. It was the 9th move of the Shangda Peak's flowing snow sword art. This move was not a real sword art, but a secret method learned by the first peak master of the Shangda Peak from the Cold Well, which was used to deal with the flying sword. Gu Han was going to use this secret method to lock Jingjiu's flying sword. Even if he had a secret method, it was still risky to deal with the flying sword with his bare hands. In the past, the disciples of Aoyama who had mastered the flowing snow sword art would only use this method in the most extreme situation. Now Gu Han had the whole situation under control, but he still chose to use this method, which showed that he was extremely aggressive and didn't take Jingju seriously at all. A buzzing sound. Gu Han put 2 fingers of his right hand together and pointed them in front of him like a small sword. He opened his left hand with 5 fingers in a circle. The iron sword was suspended in the middle and kept vibrating, but couldn't leave. The cold well locks autumn. He successfully locked Jingju's flying sword. Now it was time to see how Jingju would deal with his sword. In everyone's opinion, there would be no accident, because Jingju didn't have a sword at this time. Without a sword, he couldn't ride the sword to dodge the attacks on the cliff like before. He had to take the attack with his body. No matter how strong the body of a sword cultivator was, even if he had the tempered body of sword will like Zhao Liu and Lu Shisui and was as hard as a rock, how could he face the flying sword head-on? Some elders were ready to save him with their swords. The 2 places were far apart, but there were many mighty figures in the Broken Sea state, who could at least save Jingju's life. Zhao Liu stood up and looked over there attentively. The mountain wind suddenly blew, messing up her hair. In front of the stone platform, the thoughtless sword hovering in the air was vibrating slightly, making a low buzzing sound, as if it could fly up at any time. No one noticed that the cold 3-foot sword in front of the thoughtless sword was also vibrating slightly. In the end, the thoughtless sword didn't fly up, and the 3-foot sword didn't move. Countless exclamations were heard one after another among the peak. Because Gu Han's sword missed. There was also wind above the stone forest. Jingju's body was like the lightest sand, disappearing with the wind. The next moment, he appeared in the sky with more than 10 sword lights. Those sword lights came from his body. His hair and clothes fluttered in the wind like silk, and each strand was like a sword. The peak master of Qingrong stood up and stared in that direction, a strange expression flashing in her eyes, her sleeve trembling slightly. What kind of Tao technique was it to be able to traverse a distance of several hundred feet in the air? Even without a swordsman with a high level of cultivation could still use his sword breath to soar into the air. For example, Guananshan had demonstrated this before. The problem was that Jingju had just entered the undefeated state, and he had already mastered such a difficult Taoist method? The most shocking thing was that his speed was unimaginably fast, completely exceeding the scope of Taoist magic. It even made people think of the heaven and earth escape technique of Zhongzhou school. Jingju appeared in front of Gu Han. Gu Han was using the locking autumn by cold well to control Jingju's sword, so he didn't expect this at all. Jingju's hand landed on the hilt of the sword, and he made a seemingly simple horizontal stroke. Gu Han's hands could no longer lock Jingju's sword. Swish! The iron sword pierced through Gu Han's body. Fresh blood gushed out from the tip of the sword, dripping down from the sky. Looking at the scene a few miles away, Guananshan had a grave expression on his face. He knew that Senior Master Qi Yan and the other Senior Masters wouldn't make a move at this moment. The Senior Masters should have seen clearly that Jingju's iron sword had pierced through Gu Han's right chest. Gu Han's injury was serious, but not fatal. The Senior Masters would think that Jingju would withdraw his sword after winning. Guananshan didn't think so, and he had a bad feeling. He could sense Jingju's murderous intent from a few miles away. He knew the relationship between Jingju and Lu Shisui. Even though they hadn't seen each other for 3 years, even though Lu Shisui was extremely disappointed in Jingju not long ago. Lu Shisui was tortured by Shanghai to Peak, but he refused to tell them that he went to find Jingju that night. Now that Lu Shisui was in such a miserable state, what would Jingju do for him? Don't say he was heartless. If he was really heartless, why would he challenge Ma Hua and Gu Han? Guananshan knew he had to make a move, even if he would be blamed later. If he didn't make a move now, he was worried that Gu Han would really die. At this moment, someone finally realized something was wrong. Jingju didn't withdraw his sword. He pushed Gu Han toward the cliff in the north. Gu Han was seriously injured. Did he want to kill someone? Stop! The disciples of Tianguang Peak and Liangwang Peak shouted in surprise, but it was too late for them to stop the tragedy. Fortunately, a bright sword light pierced through the stone forest and arrived in front of the cliff a few miles away. Looking at the rainbow-like sword light, the disciples heaved a sigh of relief. Not long ago, when Lu Shui tried to kill Jian Ruoyun with the devil fire, he was stopped by this sword light. Now that the big brother in the state of free travel was wielding his sword, there was nothing to worry about. The powerful sword light hacked toward Jingju's back. If Jingju wanted to block this sword, he had to turn around and draw the iron sword out of Gu Han's body. What happened next was beyond everyone's expectation, especially Guananshan's. Jingju didn't do anything. He didn't draw the sword out, nor did he turn around. It seemed that he didn't know that a sword light had arrived behind him and would cut him in half in the next moment. Oh no! Guananshan said to himself. He saw that Jingju's hand had left the hilt of the sword and stopped the attack. But why didn't he dodge or block it? Guananshan didn't have time to think about it. All he knew was that if his flying sword were to fall down, Jingju would die for sure. He was well aware that Jingju was a rare talent in sword work that many masters had high hopes for. If this person continued to attack Gu Han, he would kill him without hesitation. But under the current circumstances, he couldn't and didn't want to kill him. However, he had just entered the state of free travel, and a few miles was his limit. It was difficult for him to control the flying sword, and he couldn't move back and forth freely. He grunted, and the sword pill suddenly shrank. He forcefully withdrew the sword's source, attempting to stop the flying sword a few miles away. The rainbow-like sword light disappeared. The flying sword finally stopped. The tip of the sword was less than 2 feet away from Jingju's back. It was a dangerous scene. All of a sudden, Jingju turned around and put his hands together, clamping the flying sword. Judging from his posture, it looked like the ritual of the Zen Buddhism. The expression on Guananshan's face changed slightly. He tried to call back the flying sword, but found it didn't work. He was a swordsman in the state of free travel, much stronger than Jingju, but the sword was in Jingju's hands, a few miles away from him. And Jingju's hands were even tougher than Gu Han's locking autumn by the cold well. The Great Mercy Hands! The peak master of Yunxing stood up, wondering in shock how Jingju knew the secret method of the Guoqing temple. The peak masters and elders who had recognized Jingju's method all had the same idea, but they remained silent at the same time, strangely. The peak master of Qingrong looked at the other side in silence, interested in what Jingju would do next. The peak master of Shilai Peak finally put down the teacup he had been holding for a long time, looking at the other side with narrowed eyes, his expression solemn. Jingju crossed his hands and held the 2 ends of the flying sword. No! No one knew who was shouting. Jingju didn't pay attention to the shout, and put more force into his hands. The flying sword in his hand gradually bent, emitting an extremely unpleasant sound. Fresh blood seeped out from between his hands and the edge of the sword. Show some mercy. Someone's voice reverberated among the peaks. Jingju looked at Guananshan in silence from a few miles away. Pa! The flying sword broke in half. Guananshan spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Chapter 106. Guananshan had just entered the state of free travel, so it was difficult for him to control the flying sword several miles away. His flying sword was destroyed, but his injuries would not be any lighter. Shameless! The disciples of Liangwang Peak were so angry that they all flew up on their swords. Dozens of sword lights illuminated the stone forest and were about to attack the west. Qi Yan came to the sky on his sword and waved his sleeve. These young disciples couldn't bear the attack of a swordsman in the upper state of free travel. A strong wind suddenly rose, and the dozens of sword lights were disrupted and forced to retreat to the cliff. Qi Yan shouted in a deep voice, "What do you want to do? Do you want me to punish you with the sect rules?" The disciples of Liangwang Peak were so angry that they couldn't bear to listen. Guananshan wiped the blood off the corner of his mouth, looked at his younger brothers and sisters, and said, "I was careless. It's none of his business." It was extremely quiet in the peak. Countless eyes fell on Jingjiu. Those eyes were complicated. Some were full of hatred, some were full of anger, but most of them were full of shock. Jingjiu had done something unimaginable. He challenged Liangwang Peak by name, unexpectedly showed the strength of the state of undefeated, and defeated Ma Hua easily. If this was normal, Gu Han, who ranked third on Liangwang Peak, was also defeated by his sword. The most shocking thing was that he broke Guananshan's sword. The key to victory was Jingjiu's hands. He put his hands together and clamped Guananshan's sword. Gu Han dared to use locking autumn by cold well because his state was much higher than Jingjiu's, so it was reasonable for him to use such a powerful fighting method. Jingjiu's state was much lower than Guananshan's, so why did he dare to do this? It couldn't be explained by courage. Whether it was locking autumn by cold well or the great mercy hand of Guoqing Temple, it was necessary to activate the sword source in advance to lock a flying sword with both hands. Jingjiu had predicted that Guananshan would attack, and he even predicted the exact time when Guananshan would do it. He had been waiting for it. This kind of fighting method was really unimaginable. After the disciples calmed down and thought about it carefully, they couldn't help but feel that it was a bit scary, but they couldn't tell what was scary about it. The Peak Masters and Qi Yan could see clearly that Jingjiu had defeated Gu Han by calculating the battle situation. He took into account Gu Han's temperament, his possible responses, the distance between the stone pillars, the position of the cliff, and even Guananshan's reaction. As a result, Guananshan was defeated without even using his sword. This kind of computing power. The mountain wind blew gently. The master of Shilai Peak was lost in thought as his white eyebrows fluttered in the wind, thinking that Jingjiu might be able to have a match with Tong Yen on the Go board at the Plum meeting next year. Those who had watched the two sword battles had to admit that Jingjiu had displayed his sword Dao cultivation and strength, but there were still many who were not convinced. Especially the disciples of Tianguang Peak and Liangwang Peak. They were not convinced on behalf of Guananshan. Guananshan was the principal disciple of the sect master of Aoyama, and also the principal disciple of Liangwang Peak, so he had a high reputation among his peers. Today, he had demonstrated the strength of the state of free travel for the first time. Even though Jingjiu was a rare genius in sword work, how could he be his match? In the eyes of many disciples, Jingjiu would have died if their big brother hadn't forcefully pulled back his sword because he couldn't bear to attack. Jingjiu didn't feel grateful, but took advantage of the opportunity to attack. It was extremely shameless. But they didn't realize that Guananshan's intention was to save Gu Han, but in fact it was 2 against 1. I didn't ask anyone to stop. No one is allowed to draw out their swords, otherwise it would be against the rules. Moreover, he used his sword to sneakily attack a master. Looking at those disciples who were still not convinced, Qi Yan said in a low voice, "For the sake of his concern for his peers, Shangda Peak won't punish him for offending his superiors." Hearing this, many disciples came back to their senses, feeling even more upset and angry. Jingjiu wasn't an ordinary disciple participating in the sword trial. He was the senior uncle. Though Gu Han was seriously injured, his life was not in danger. After a simple treatment, he was helped back to the field by his junior brothers. "If you are so capable, you should have stood out when Lu Shisui was in trouble," he said to Jingjiu with hatred. Jingjiu said, I stood out now, but it seems that you are not ready to bear the consequences. His words attracted even more angry gazes. Zhao Lei stood up. A light blue pearl emitting a faint fluorescent light fell from the sky, falling from the deepest part of the great formation of Aoyama to her, and then she put it into her sleeve. Shinma Peak wants a place. After saying this, she took Jingjiu and flew up on her sword. The red sword light drew a straight line, leading to Shinma Peak. By dusk, the sword trial of Aoyama had come to an end. Yao Songzhan and other 8 disciples were qualified to participate in next year's plum meeting. The last place belonged to Jingjiu, though he didn't stay until the end. Zhao Lei made a clear request as the master of Shinma Peak, and he had defeated Gu Han fair and square. Everybody had to admit that he was absolutely qualified. The masters and disciples of the peaks left one after another. For a moment, the sky was filled with sword lights, and the sunset seemed to be torn into countless red ribbons. Yet, the peak masters didn't leave. The setting sun shone on the stone platforms in the cliff. It was quiet. As the principal disciple of the sect master and the principal disciple of Liangwang Peak, Guananshan had a high status in Aoyama, and the regular elders were far less important than him. Normally, even though Jingjiu was the senior uncle, he should pay a price for hurting him in such a way. There were only 4 young people and a group of monkeys in Shinma Peak, so they didn't have much power in Aoyama. Yet, the peak masters didn't express any opinion, and they even had the intention to protect Jingjiu. Even the master of Tianguang Peak had kept silent, not to mention Elder Mo and Bai Rujing, who had always admired Jingjiu. There could only be one explanation for this. They thought that Jingjiu was more important than Gu Han or Guananshan for the Aoyama sect. No matter how sharp Jingjiu was in the use of sword and how powerful his calculation ability was, he had to have the ability to make it happen if he wanted to achieve such an incredible feat. Until now, the peak masters still couldn't forget the 2 scenes of the fight. Jingjiu's hands clamped the sword. The other scene was Gu Han locked Jingjiu's sword, and Jingjiu suddenly disappeared from the stone pillar and appeared in front of Gu Han the next moment. The peak masters were big shots in Aoyama sect, and they had seen many geniuses and unimaginable things on the long road of cultivation. Why were they so impressed by this scene, and why were they so cautious? Because they were the only ones who noticed a detail in that scene. When Jingjiu stepped on the air and appeared in front of Gu Han, his fluttering clothes and even his hair were carrying rays of sword light. Is it really the born sword body? The voice of Yunqing Peak Master was a little hesitant, because he couldn't believe his own judgment. There had always been a speculation in the cultivation world. What would happen if the sword pill in a cultivator's body didn't merge with the flying sword, but with the cultivator himself? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.